It was a gray afternoon when Emily, exhausted from the long journey, decided to take an alternate route on her way home. The deserted road stretched for miles, surrounded by growing darkness. There were no signs of life or other vehicles, only the roar of the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. The engine of her car echoed in the stillness of the landscape, and she took the opportunity to relax. As she drove, she began to feel a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. She shook her head and told herself that it was just tiredness. However, something was not right. His phone above the passenger seat vibrated suddenly. Emily frowned at the screen. He didn't recognize the number but decided to answer, hoping it was an important call. "Hello, who's talking?" she said in a tired voice, trying to sound calm. At first there was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Emily raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "Hello?" he repeated, looking at the phone with growing uneasiness. Finally, a trembling voice emerged from the darkness on the other end of the line. "Help me. Please," said the male voice, full of despair. "I'm trapped. I don't know where I am. There's something here. Something that is looking at me. He's chasing me." Emily felt a wave of discomfort run down her spine. The voice was distorted, as if the man was in a dark, terrifying place. "Who are you?" he asked, his pulse racing. Fear was beginning to creep into his voice. Before he could receive an answer, the call was abruptly cut off, leaving only the echo of the stranger's heavy breathing. Emily, her hands sweaty, looked at her phone for signs of life, but there was nothing. There were no messages, no missed call logs, just the blank screen. He stared at his phone for a few seconds, his mind racing for answers. Just a joke, he thought. It must be someone playing with me. However, a strange sensation lingered in the air. She decided to continue on her way, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, Emily tried to forget what happened, blaming it on the stress and fatigue of the trip. However, something inside him told him not to ignore it. She was used to being alone on her travels, but she had never felt anything so unsettling. The latent sense of danger never went away. One night, after arriving at her apartment, Emily checked her phone and saw something that left her paralyzed. A message without a sender or any information. When he opened it, he saw a recording. She played it without knowing why, as if something pushed her to do it. The audio that began to play was the same as that of the mysterious call. The same desperate voice, the same gasping breath. But what made her tremble with terror wasn't just the voice. It was the sound of a whisper filtering through the end of the recording. Something enigmatic, almost inaudible, but clearly audible to anyone paying attention. "Don't look back," the whisper said, like a warning. A shiver ran through his body. Suddenly he realized that there was something much more sinister behind that call. Something dark that was following her. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore it. He decided to investigate. However, I had no idea what I was about to discover. Emily began to go through her phone logs, looking for something that might lead her to understand what had happened on the road. When he accessed the call history, something strange happened. There on the list, he saw the call from the unknown number, but with a peculiar detail. The time she was received did not coincide with the time she had been behind the wheel. It was as if the call had been recorded long before she answered it. The mystery increased, but something worse awaited her. That same night, Emily began receiving text messages. They were short, meaningless, but chilling. "You're closer than you think," said the first. The following message came shortly after. "Don't leave the house." Another, an hour later. "Time is running out." The messages intensified as the days progressed. Emily couldn't ignore them. She began to feel like she was being watched constantly, even though there were no obvious signs that anyone was around. At all hours, I felt the presence of a shadow, something I couldn't see but that was always lurking. The situation escalated when, one morning, Emily woke up with the feeling that something was not right. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with electricity. When she got out of bed and looked out the window, she saw something that left her paralyzed. On the other side of the street, in the gloom, there was a figure. Tall, thin, motionless. A figure she couldn't identify, but who seemed to be staring at her. Panic took hold of Emily. He closed the curtains quickly, trying to calm himself. I needed to get out of there. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but he felt that his life was in danger. He picked up his phone and saw one more notification. A message with an attachment. The file was a photo taken from his own window, showing his figure looking out. The tall and slender figure was now closer, so close that I could see her eyes, which glowed in the dark. In a fit of desperation, Emily ran to her car and drove to the place where she had first received the call. The deserted road, now covered in a thick fog, seemed even more unsettling than before. When he arrived at the scene, he turned on the car's lights, looking for any sign of what had happened. There, in the darkness, he saw something on the ground. It was his phone. The phone I'd forgotten. The phone that had witnessed everything that had happened. Upon picking it up, the device turned on its own, and a new notification appeared. You are too close to finding out the truth. Now there is no turning back. A heart-rending scream filled the air, and Emily felt something horrible loom over her. The phone began to make a strange sound, as if something was happening on the other end of the line. However, there was no one there. Everything was silent, except for the sound of his own breathing, quickened by fear. Emily tried to run, but the ground began to shake under her feet. At that moment, a dark figure emerged from the fog. It was the same being in the photo, his face deformed and his gaze fixed on her. She had no human face, only empty eyes that stared at her with terrifying intensity. The figure moved forward, sliding on the ground, and Emily, paralyzed with terror, tried to scream. But his voice did not come out. Only the sound of fog and heavy breathing surrounded her. The phone fell to the floor, and with it all hope. The figure caught up with her, and Emily disappeared into the darkness, absorbed in the terror that had haunted her from the moment she answered that call. The investigation that followed was puzzling. The phone, which was found at the scene, contained more messages. Some sent before Emily's disappearance, others after. The recordings and photos she had received indicated that someone had been following her from the moment she accepted that call. No one knew who was behind the threat, but the case remained unsolved. The authorities never found a concrete clue, and the forgotten phone remained stored as a macabre memory of the inexplicable. Emily's disappearance became a legend, a horror story whispered in the dark, where the forgotten phone was the key, and the figure in the fog, the eternal nightmare that haunted those naive enough to answer an unknown call. Night hung over the house with an eerie stillness, silence only interrupted by the occasional sound of a branch hitting the window. Laura was in her living room, embraced by the gloom that filtered through the curtains. The dim light of the table lamp dimly illuminated the book in his hands. In those moments of loneliness, I always found solace in the pages of a good novel, an escape from the daily grind. Tonight, however, something seemed different, something in the air that he couldn't clearly identify. The wall clock struck 9, and Laura heard a noise that broke the tranquility. A soft knock, as if someone were knocking on the door. He got up from the couch and walked toward the entrance, a slight feeling of discomfort running down his back. I never expected visitors at that time. He looked out the window before opening the door, but saw no one. A shiver ran through his body, though he tried to ignore it. After all, it could be children playing or someone in the wrong house. He opened the door, and there he was, a man standing in his doorway. He had a serious appearance, with a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. Laura stared at him, bewildered. She didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Good evening," the man said in a deep but calm voice. "Laura, right?" Laura frowned, overwhelmed by a growing sense of unease. "Yes, but I don't know you. How do you know my name?" The man smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I told you, Laura. We know each other, even if you don't remember it." Laura blinked, confused. What was he talking about? She had never seen that man in her life. How could I meet her? The air in the room seemed to have become dense, as if the atmosphere itself was being charged with something indescribable. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," Laura said, trying to remain calm as she took a step back. "I don't know you." The man stood there, motionless, watching her with an uncomfortable intensity. Without saying a word, his eyes flashed for a moment with a strange light. Laura, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, preventing him from doing so. "You don't need to be nervous," she said with an eerie calm. "I just want to talk. It's important." Laura's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her was telling her to be alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the house, which had once been her refuge, suddenly seemed like a strange alien place. "What do you want?" he asked in a thin voice, trying to stay in control. The man stared at her before answering. "Come with me," There are things you need to remember. A shiver ran down Laura's spine. What things should I remember? The feeling of fear invaded her completely, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel intrigued. Something about the way the man spoke made her feel like she couldn't just refuse him. "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," he finally said, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. But the man didn't seem to flinch at the threat. "You can do it if you prefer," he replied with unsettling calmness, "but it won't change anything." Laura felt a growing pressure in her chest. The need to understand what was happening prompted her to take a step back, reluctantly allowing her into her home. The man walked into the room with terrifying naturalness, as if he had been there thousands of times before. "I shouldn't have," Laura muttered to herself, though she knew it was too late. The door closed with a dull sound, and the house was filled with an ominous calm, as if time itself had stopped. The air seemed denser, and the darkness thicker. She sat down on the couch, unable to take her eyes off the man. He sat down in front of her, his arms folded, staring at her. "What I want you to remember is that," he finally said. "Remember what you forgot." Laura frowned, completely bewildered. "I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know you. Who are you?" The man stared at her, and for an instant, Laura saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if there was a connection between them, something deep and ancient that I couldn't comprehend. The feeling of dread grew inside him. "I am someone from your past," he replied, his voice deeper. "Someone who knows you better than you think, and something you forgot comes looking for you." Laura didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Something in his tone, in his gaze, caused a feeling of deep terror to take hold of her, a primitive fear, as if something that had been hidden for a long time was about to be revealed. "Leave me alone," he said, rising quickly from the couch. But when she turned to the door, a piercing cry stopped her. "You can't run away from who you are." The scream echoed throughout the house, and at that moment Laura felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. He looked at the man in horror, feeling the air grow even denser, as if his own breath was getting heavier and heavier. "What do you want from me?" he murmured, his voice trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man slowly got up, approaching her unhurriedly, as if he knew there was no escape. "What I want you to remember is that you remember everything you have forgotten." Laura backed away, but the shadows of the house seemed to envelop her, barring any attempt to flee. His heart was pounding, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. The man looked at her with that same frightful calmness, and at that moment, she understood something that made her blood run cold. She was no longer alone. In the stillness of a remote corner of the forest, where the shadows of the trees stretched like the arms of a sleeping giant, a man named Marcos arrives at an isolated cabin to escape the busy city life. I had heard about the beauty of nature in that place, and the tranquility it offered. No worries, no pressures, no constant invasion of the modern world. Just him and the landscape. That was all he needed to rest from his daily routine. The cottage, though rustic and somewhat dated, had the charm of the old days, with a stone fireplace, large windows overlooking the thick forest, and a sense of seclusion that pleased him. It was everything you could want for a solo holiday, without the interference of people or the bustle of everyday life. That night, after a day exploring the forest, he lit a fire in the fireplace and sat down on the sofa, deep in thought. The creaking of burning wood was the only sound that interrupted the deep silence of the night. Shadows danced on the walls of the cabin, as the darkness outside stretched beyond the reach of the light. He went to bed early that night, exhausted from the walk, but something in the air kept him restless. There was something strange about the stillness, something I couldn't identify. He tried to calm his mind, but the feeling persisted. He closed his eyes and fell into a restless sleep. Dawn came with a faint glow, barely filtered through the leaves that covered the windows. Mark woke up abruptly, feeling a strange pressure in the air. It was not the sound of the wind, nor the nature that I used to hear in the morning. Something felt different, as if the atmosphere were charged with an unsettling energy. When he got out of bed, he noticed something strange. On the floor of the room, right in front of the door, there was a large footprint, bright red, as if someone had left a mark on the ground, but it looked like anything else. The footprint wasn't just fresh blood. It was as if the mark was alive, latent, as if it had been left behind by something far more sinister than a simple accident. Marcos approached cautiously, the air in the room weighing on him like a blanket. The footprint stretched across the floor, leading to the door of the cabin. Trembling, he bent down to examine her more closely. It wasn't a mistake, nor something that could have been left by accident. It was a clear mark, an ominous sign that seemed to mock him. The footprint did not end there. When he opened the door, he noticed that he continued down the hallway, down the stairs to the main entrance of the cabin. Panic began to take hold of him, but curiosity grew stronger. He decided to follow the track, although he felt the weight of fear crushing his chest. As the footprint moved along the outside of the cabin, the feeling that something was watching him intensified. The nature around was in complete silence. Not the wind, not the birds, not the insects. Only the sound of his own footsteps stepping on the damp earth. The footprint led him into the forest, a shadowy path that led into the thick trees. Every step he took into the heart of the forest seemed to make him farther away from the safety of the cabin. The daylight was no longer enough to dispel the shadows which seemed to lengthen towards him, slowly surrounding him. Gradually, the footprint began to show an increasingly grotesque shape. Instead of being just a mark of blood, it now seemed to be accompanied by strange distortions, as if the terrain itself was being altered by something invisible. The earth was marked by strange signs, ancient symbols that I could not comprehend. The panic began to turn into something deeper. Mark tried to turn back, but the footprint drew him, as if he had a will of his own, as if something in the forest was calling him, guiding him. In his attempt to return to the cabin, he noticed that the forest looked different now. The treetops, once familiar, now looked strange, as if they were watching him, as if they knew him. A shudder ran down his spine. When he arrived at a clearing in the forest, he saw something that completely paralyzed him. In the center of the clearing, there was a figure erect, standing, waiting. The figure was indistinct, without clear features, but its presence was terrifying. It wasn't human, but it seemed to have a form, a structure. An echo of his humanity, but distorted. The bloody footprint had led him there. And as he approached, the figure moved. The scene in front of him crumbled into chaos. The earth began to tremble, and the air became dense, as if an invisible force imprisoned it. The figure in the clearing dissolved, and the shadows of the trees began to twist, growing towards him. The ground split, and what seemed like an unbreakable peace turned into a nightmare of horror and despair. Marcos tried to run, but each step he took plunged him deeper into darkness. The bloody footprint, like a threat from the unknown, haunted him. Every time he turned, he saw the distortions in the air, the symbols gliding over the ground. The trees seemed to move, as if they were part of a sentient entity, watching him, stalking. The horror reached its peak when it reached the edge of a precipice. The forest seemed to have engulfed him, and all that remained was emptiness. The bloody footprint was there on the edge of the abyss, and Mark, now completely plunged into terror, saw a figure emerge from the shadows, his own reflection distorted, grotesque, standing in front of him. And then, as if all the accumulated terror had only one purpose, the footprint began to drag him away. A violent tug pushed him into the abyss, into the void, as the shadows devoured him completely. The man disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the man, the bloody one, as if it had never existed, vanished into the earth. The echo of his cry echoed in the distance, but no one heard him. The forest, again in silence, kept the last vestige of its passage, until another visitor arrived, unwary to follow the trail of the bloody track. Whitehaven Island, a small, isolated piece of land in the middle of the murky waters of the North Sea, had been a mystery for years. For a long time, the few inhabitants who remained on its shores lived a quiet life, without much contact with the rest of the world. The island, though small and modest, was steeped in ancient history, full of secrets buried under layers of land forgotten by time. But all that changed on a gray autumn afternoon when a group of tourists, in their eagerness to know the place and its mysteries, decided to venture on the island without knowing what awaited them. The group never returned. Local authorities, alarmed by the unexplained disappearance, sent several expeditions in search of the tourists, but never found a trace of their presence. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the case of the missing from Whitehaven went from front-page news to a story forgotten by most. No one knew what had happened on the island. However, the rumors did not stop. 5 years after the group's demise, things began to change. Stories were whispered among the locals of strange sightings and unexplained occurrences. Bright lights on the darkest nights, shadows moving through the trees, and unmistakable voices in the breeze that seemed to carry echoes of something lost. However, what most terrified those who lived in the vicinity was the growing number of stories about people who said they had returned from the island. People who had disappeared for years, but now walked the streets of the town again. At first, people thought they were simple coincidences, but as time progressed, the stories became more disturbing. No one seemed to be able to explain the return of the disappeared, let alone the strange behaviors exhibited by those who claimed to have returned. Many people were skeptical, but those who met these people soon began to feel a chill running down their spine. The people who returned were not the same. There was something deeply altered in their eyes, something that made them seem different, empty, as if they were living in a parallel reality, completely disconnected from the life they had known before. The whole town began to murmur. No one knew what had happened on Whitehaven Island. No one knew what had changed those tourists who at first seemed to be ordinary people. A sense of fear and distrust took hold of the locals, and those returning from the island could not fit in. There was something inhuman about them, something that couldn't be explained in words. At first, those affected tried to continue with their lives, trying to reintegrate into the village and their former circles. However, over time, their behaviors became more bizarre and puzzling. Some of them were talking about things that no one understood, as if they were repeating the same phrases in a forgotten or unintelligible language. Others were silent, with an empty and disconnected expression, as if they could not remember anything from their previous life. The people close to them were beginning to feel a sense of unease, as if something dark and dangerous was surrounding them. The town's mayor, concerned about the growing number of incidents, called a meeting in the central square. On the night before the meeting, one of the returnees, a woman named Clara, disappeared again without a trace, only to appear at dawn in the center of the village, covered in dirt and with a completely empty expression. The few witnesses who saw her came to an agreement. Something had changed inside her, something deeply disturbing. At the meeting, the villagers were frantically arguing about what to do with those who returned. Some believed they should be isolated, others feared they might be a threat. Panic took hold of everyone when the stories began to arrive more frequently. No one knew if those who were returning were really the people who had disappeared, or if something else had taken them, altering them, transforming them into something else. It was at that moment that a young researcher named Samuel arrived in town. Samuel was a freelance journalist, known for his desire to unravel the darkest mysteries, and he had heard about the strange happenings in Whitehaven. He decided to travel to the island to discover the truth behind the returnees. With the approval of the local authorities, Samuel boarded a small boat to the island. As he approached the shore, he couldn't help but feel that something in the air was deeply wrong. The sky was covered by dark clouds, and the sea seemed more violent than normal. Whitehaven Island, which had once been quiet, now seemed to radiate an unsettling energy. Upon arrival, Samuel began to explore the island. In his first steps, he noticed something strange. The place was deserted with no signs of life, as if the island itself had been forgotten by time. But as he moved further inland, Samuel realized he wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was watching his movements, walking among the trees and moss-covered rocks. Samuel found what looked like a cave hidden among the hills. Intrigued, he went into it. Darkness enveloped him as he advanced through the narrow passage. And then, at the bottom of the cave, he saw something that left him cold. A set of strange symbols were etched into the walls of the cave, symbols that did not belong to any known culture. They were ancient, so profoundly old that they defied human logic. As Samuel watched them, a sense of anguish came over him. He felt as if something was awakening in the depths of the island, something he had been waiting for centuries. Suddenly the cave began to tremble, and a strange vibration ran through his entire body. Samuel tried to get out, but the walls seemed to move, closing around him. It was then that he heard voices, soft at first, like a whisper in the distance. The voices grew louder, closer, until suddenly they stopped. And then he saw something he would never forget. The missing tourists, the same ones who had returned to the village, were standing in front of him, their eyes empty and their bodies motionless. They were there, but they were not the same. Something had transformed them. Something had possessed them. At that moment, Samuel understood what had happened. The island had not only been a place of isolation, it had been a point of convergence, a space where dark forces had infiltrated the human world. The people who returned were not human. They had been altered, possessed by an ancestral entity that controlled them. And that entity had been patiently waiting for his return. As the island began to crumble around him, Samuel tried to flee but couldn't. Darkness surrounded him, and the voices of the missing were transformed into deafening screams. The cave swallowed it all, and Whitehaven Island, with all its secrets and horrors, was sealed forever. The villagers never heard of Samuel again. The returnees, if they could still be called that, continued to wander the streets, their gaze empty and their soul lost forever. And the island, with its hidden terror, continued to wait for the next victim. It was a gray day when Daniel and Laura decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. After months of constant stress, they decided that all they needed was the fresh air of the forest and the tranquility of a cabin away from everything. A couple of days, just the two of them, surrounded by nature, where they could relax without worries. The cabin they rented was in a small, secluded corner, where there were no houses nearby and hardly any phone signals. The road meandered between tall trees that towered like giants, mostly covering the sunlight. When they arrived, they realized how far away everything really was. There was not a store, not a sign of human life for miles around. The cabin was small, rustic but cozy. Outside, time seemed to have stopped, as if it were a refuge forgotten by all. "This is perfect," Laura said, dropping her suitcase on the dusty porch floor. "We need this. Time to disconnect." Daniel smiled, though he couldn't deny that something in the air was strange to him. There was something unsettling about the stillness of the place. But he ignored it, thinking it was just his mind burdened by the pressures of the city. What he didn't know was that the calm they longed for would be interrupted by something much more terrifying. The cabin had the essentials: a fireplace that crackled softly, a kitchenette, and a couple of cozy rooms. As they settled in, Daniel and Laura felt more relaxed, forgetting the stresses of work and everyday life. But soon, the first shadows of uneasiness began to appear. That night, after a quiet dinner by the fire, they retired to their room. As Laura settled into bed, Daniel leaned out of the window, looking out the forest around the cabin. The full moon was high in the sky, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the thickness of the trees. "I couldn't help but feel a sense of being watched, even though I couldn't see anything." "Is everything okay?" asked Laura from the bed. "Yes, just the silence is so absolute here," Daniel replied, closing the curtain and turning off the light. But when he tried to sleep, Daniel's sleep was interrupted by strange noises, a distant creak, as if something or someone is moving through the trees. At first he thought it might be an animal, but then the sound repeated, closer, as if someone was approaching the cabin. Daniel tried to ignore it, blaming it on the stress and loneliness of the place. But the creaks continued until a loud bang made him get out of bed. "Did you hear that?" Daniel whispered, looking at Laura, who was already awake. She nodded, looking out the window. "Yes, as if someone is nearby. Should we go and look?" "Number. Let's better stay here and check tomorrow. It's very dark outside." Laura wasn't so sure. Something in the air kept her alert, but she trusted Daniel, and the cabin was safe, or so she thought. The next morning, they didn't mention the noises of the night. The light of day brought with it a false sense of security. They decided to take a walk in the woods, exploring the surroundings. As they walked, Daniel felt the strange sensation of being watched again. Every time he turned his head, he saw nothing, but the feeling lingered, as if something was watching them from the shadows of the trees. "I don't know, Laura. This place scares me a little. Perhaps we should have looked for something closer to civilization." "Come on, don't be paranoid. It's just a forest and we're all alone." "There's something soothing about this silence," Laura replied, though she also felt a growing discomfort in her chest. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of their footsteps and the breeze moving the leaves of the trees were the only things that broke the silence. But as they advanced, something else began to add tension to the atmosphere. Some branches creaked near them, and when they looked, they saw nothing and no one. "Who else could be here?" muttered Daniel, looking around more nervously. "Don't worry, it's just an animal. Let's keep walking," Laura said, though her words lacked the confidence she had had before. By the time they returned to the cabin, night had already begun to fall, and the sense of unease intensified. That night, Terror did not take long to arrive. During dinner, Laura and Daniel tried to talk about anything to distract themselves, but something in the air made the words feel empty. It was after dinner, when Daniel sat down in the chair by the fireplace, that they heard a creak again, but this time louder, almost above their heads. The two looked at each other, their eyes full of dread. "What was that?" asked Laura, her voice trembling. "I think something is on the ceiling." Daniel got up quickly, looking up anxiously. It's impossible." The noises continued. As they intensified, they began to hear what seemed like footsteps dragging on the ceiling, heavy as if someone was walking on the wooden beams. The thought that someone could be there watching them caused terror to take hold of them. "We have to get out of here," Laura said, visibly terrified. "But we can't. We are very far from anywhere. We have no other options. Maybe it's just the wind or an animal. We're going to close everything, lock the gates, and wait for it to happen." Paranoia began to creep into their minds, as the sense that they were not alone became more and more palpable. Upon returning to their room, the sound of something hitting the windows made them jump in fear. "The window. Look at the window," Laura whispered, pointing to the window. Something dark and blurry moved on the other side. Fear gripped them as the sound of scratching on the window continued. Laura tried to take a closer look, but she couldn't see anything. However, he felt that something was stalking them from the outside. "We have to go now," exclaimed Daniel, clutching his jacket in despair. "Come on, Laura, come on." But when they both tried to open the door to escape, something stopped them. The door wouldn't budge. It was sealed from the outside. Panic set in when they discovered they couldn't open the door. They tried with all their might, but the lock seemed to have been locked from the outside. Laura, her face pale, began to breathe rapidly, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. Daniel stared at her desperately, trying to find a solution, but all he saw was darkness and the creaking of wood around them. "We can't stay here. Something is not right. What the hell is going on?" said Daniel, sweating and looking anxiously into every corner of the room. Suddenly, the lamplight went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The creaking of the wood coming from the ceiling now felt closer, as if someone was slowly descending, approaching them. Both of them, paralyzed with fear, approached the window, but something in the air told them that looking outside would only make things worse. "We have to get out of here no matter what it takes," Laura said in a trembling voice. Laura began to bang on the window with all her might, but the glass would not give way. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness outside, its dark outline silhouetted against the dim moonlight. Daniel screamed, but the voice choked in his throat as he saw the silhouette moving through the trees, watching them mercilessly. "What is that?" "Who's there?" asked Laura, her voice breaking. There was no response, only the growing sense that something horrible was about to happen. The figure stood there, motionless, its eyes fixed on them. Panic began to engulf them as they tried to find a way out, but the feeling that they were being watched only intensified. "Help me!" shouted Laura, finally giving in to the terror that consumed her. But there was no response. The world seemed to have stopped, and the only sound was the rustling of trees swaying in the wind. Without warning, the figure disappeared into the trees. Daniel breathed heavily, trying to process what he had just seen. The figure that had been lurking around the hut seemed to fade into nothingness, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was not right. There was something they couldn't see, but around them, like a presence seeping through the shadows, lurking. The clock on the wall made an almost imperceptible sound, but loud enough to break the absolute silence. Laura and Daniel looked at each other in terror, the words getting stuck in their throats. "We can't stay here," Daniel muttered as he tried to think of a way out. "We have to find a way out." With their hearts racing, they began to look for any possible way to escape. But it was at that moment that the door burst open, as if something had unlocked it from the outside. Moonlight immediately poured in, illuminating the room in eerie shadows. The figure was gone, but the sense of danger was stronger than ever. Without thinking twice, Daniel and Laura left the cabin in a hurry, running into the woods without looking back. The ground was wet and branches hit their faces as they ran frantically. They could hear footsteps behind them, the rustling of branches and leaves moving. They didn't know if it was the figure chasing them or something more sinister, but they didn't dare to look. "Run, Laura! Run!" shouted Daniel, feeling his breath ragged. Anxiety consumed them, and every second it seemed like something was catching up with them. But when they turned to see if there was anything behind it, The figure was gone. There was no trace of anything, only the thick fog that began to envelop them. The trees, which had once seemed harmless, now stood like dark giants, and the darkness of the forest seemed to devour them. There was no visible path, no lights, only the thick gloom that surrounded them. Daniel and Laura reached the edge of the forest, where the road seemed distant as if they could never reach it. The feeling of dread consumed them, but at that moment, Laura fell to her knees, exhausted and trembling. "What's going on? Why can't we get out of here?" sobbed Laura, looking out over the woods where the shadows moved as if they were alive. Daniel tried to comfort her, but he also felt the growing despair. Something was catching them, something much bigger than them, something they couldn't understand. Suddenly, a heart-rending scream echoed through the air, a voice that was not human. Something appeared on the threshold of the trees, a tall figure shrouded in darkness. His face was an indescribable shadow, but his eyes, two empty abysses, shone with a frightful intensity. The figure was watching them, and something in his eyes made their skin stand on end. "No, it can't be," shouted Daniel, as the figure slowly advanced towards them. Fear paralyzed them. They didn't know what that thing was or where it had come from. They only knew that they could not escape. The air around them thickened, as if time itself had stopped. The figure raised his arm, pointing at them, and a barely audible whisper could be heard in the wind. Laura and Daniel's name was whispered in their ears like a distant echo. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake, and an invisible force pushed them to the ground. Fear turned to absolute terror. They were no longer in the same place. They had been transported to another world, a gloomy and dark place, where the trees twisted into grotesque shapes, and the air was thick and oppressive. The empty-eyed figure slowly approached them, its shadow enveloping them, and with one swift motion took them, absorbing them in the darkness. The cabin, the forest, everything disappeared in a breath, and all that remained was the sound of the wind, carrying with it the whispers of those who had been observed, until they could never be reached. A group of 5 friends, all with hiking experience, decided to go on a trip to the Shadow Hill Forest. They had heard the stories and legends that haunted that place since they were children. Stories that spoke of unexplained disappearances, of people who never returned after entering the forest. However, what originally seemed to be a challenging adventure would quickly turn into a nightmare that would test not only his bravery, but his deepest fears. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the edge of the Shadow Hill Forest. The treetops formed a dark blanket that blocked much of the light. Despite the sinister reputation of that place, the 5 friends did not let fear stop them. They were used to walking in nature, and they believed that stories were just that, stories. They decided to camp near a clearing, a small open area between the trees, which offered them a quiet view of the starry sky. They prepared to spend a relaxed night surrounded by nature, not knowing that this would be the last moment of calm they would experience. As the night wore on, the shadows of the forest seemed to lengthen, and a strange stillness came over the place. None of the friends could remember exactly when it started, but something changed in the air. The wind stopped blowing, and a deep silence invaded the space. Suddenly, one of the group members, Sarah, felt someone watching her. He turned toward the forest, looking for some sign, but saw nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the trees. "Did you hear that?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. The others were silent, listening intently, but there was no response. Everything was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by the sound of something rustling in the distance, as if someone were walking through the dry foliage. "It's just the wind," Mark said, trying to sound confident, but his tone wasn't as convincing as he thought. Suddenly, a piercing scream broke the stillness, coming from somewhere nearby. They all got up, terrified, looking around. The sound was so close, but they couldn't see anything. "What was that?" muttered John, his voice raspy on. The group decided that it would be best to leave the camp and return to the starting point, but something prevented them from moving. A sense of unease bound them to the ground, as if the forest would not let them escape. That's when something strange began to happen. Sarah, the most intrepid of the group, stepped forward and began to walk into the woods. "I'm going to investigate," he said without hesitation. The others tried to stop her, but something in her eyes made them hesitate. She seemed to be being drawn to something beyond her comprehension. Suddenly, Sarah disappeared into the trees, as if the forest itself had swallowed her. His friends called his name, but there was no answer. The darkness swallowed all sound, and panic began to take hold of them. "Sarah!" Mark shouted desperately, running to where he had last seen her. But when he reached the edge of the forest, he found only a series of strange footprints, deeply marked on the ground, which disappeared into the blackness of the forest. There was no trace of her. The friends stared at the footprints, terrified. They knew something wasn't right, but the darkness prevented them from seeing beyond. They decided to look for it, but as they went along, the atmosphere of the forest seemed to become denser, as if they were being watched by something they couldn't comprehend. The footprints were getting stranger, as if something had painted them on purpose. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Emma, who was visibly shaking. "Why are there symbols on trees?" The symbols were strange, incomprehensible, with geometric shapes that did not correspond to any culture they knew. The figures seemed to move subtly, as if they had a life of their own. The feeling that someone or something was stalking them intensified. Every time they approached one of the symbols, a cold current ran through their bodies, and a shiver ran through them. The group, now completely nervous and not knowing what to do, decided to return to the camp to think of a plan. But when they arrived, something worse awaited them. The camp was completely messy. The backpacks were open, the equipment was scattered on the ground, and the campfire had already been extinguished. The scariest thing, however, was the fact that Sarah's footprints were still there. But instead of disappearing into the forest, they were returning to the camp, surrounding the area where they were now. "What's going on here?" John whispered, his eyes filled with terror. A low, almost imperceptible whisper hung in the air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Help! Help! Help!" he repeated, echoing like an echo. "It's Sarah!" shouted Emma, hoping she was still nearby. But the echo only multiplied, repeating the name of each member of the group, distorted and sinister. In the background, something moved quickly among the trees. A low whistle, like that of a creature in the dark, cut through the air. Panic broke out. Suddenly, Mark disappeared. None of them saw him leave, but when they turned their heads to look for him, he was gone. Only the footprints remained, which seemed to crawl into the forest, into the deep and unreachable. With terror running high, the group began to run, but every step they took seemed to be in vain. The forest, which had at first seemed like a challenge, now closed in on them like a trap. Darkness enveloped them. Branches creaked as if something was moving quickly, and the voices of their missing comrades echoed in their ears. One by one, the figures of friends began to disappear. First Emma, then John, and finally only Clara remained, looking around in horror, unable to comprehend what was happening. She looked up at the sky, looking for the moon, looking for the light, but everything seemed to get even darker. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. And then, he saw it. From deep within the forest, a tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, but it wasn't a beast either. His face was covered by a black cloak, and his eyes shone with a deep, piercing green glow that seemed to pierce his soul. The creature raised a hand, and Clara felt a pressure in her chest, an excruciating pain that forced her to fall to her knees. "Welcome, Clara," whispered a deep, guttural voice, as if coming from the very bowels of the forest. "You're the last." With a final scream, Clara disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The forest of Shadow Hill had claimed its last victim. The echoes of the lost voices echoed through the air, while the symbols on the trees shone with a spectral light. No one else came back from that forest. And the cycle continued, waiting for new unwary people who, like the group of hikers, would challenge the legend and disappear one by one into the darkness of Shadow Hill. The scene in front of him crumbled into chaos. The earth began to tremble and the air became dense, as if an invisible force imprisoned it. The figure in the clearing dissolved, and the shadows of the trees began to twist, growing towards him. The ground split, and what seemed like an unbreakable peace turned into a nightmare of horror and despair. Marcos tried to run, but each step he took plunged him deeper into darkness. The bloody footprint, like a threat from the unknown, haunted him. Every time he turned, he saw the distortions in the air, the symbols gliding over the ground. The trees seemed to move, as if they were part of a sentient entity, watching him, stalking. The horror reached its peak when it reached the edge of a precipice. The forest seemed to have engulfed him, and all that remained was emptiness. The bloody footprint was there on the edge of the abyss, and Mark, now completely plunged into terror, saw a figure emerge from the shadows, his own reflection distorted, grotesque, standing in front of him. And then, as if all the accumulated terror had only one purpose, the footprint began to drag him away. A violent tug pushed him into the abyss, into the void, as the shadows devoured him completely. The man disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the man, the bloody one, as if it had never existed, vanished into the earth. The echo of his cry echoed in the distance, but no one heard him. The forest, again in silence, kept the last vestige of its passage, until another visitor arrived, unwary to follow the trail of the bloody track. The rain was pouring down on the small town. An icy wind whipped through the windows of the car while Lara watched through the foggy glass. He had traveled hundreds of miles to get there, following the clues his mother had left him in an old letter. In it, he told her about the cabin in which he had grown up, a place that seemed to be shrouded in mystery and darkness. Lara had never met her grandmother, and her mother never spoke of her, but there was something about the tone of the letter that had intrigued her, a kind of call she couldn't ignore. The car stopped in front of the cottage's entrance, an old building surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to whisper to each other. Lara took a deep breath before getting out of the vehicle, feeling the humidity of the night take over her skin. As he approached the door of the cabin, the air became heavier, as if the place was waiting for something. He entered the cabin, and the first shiver ran down his spine. The air was stale, permeated with a smell of old wood and dampness. The dim light of an oil lamp illuminated the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs. The wooden beams creaked softly, as if the place breathed on its own. Lara watched every corner cautiously, her mind filled with unanswered questions. At first, everything seemed calm. He decided to explore, looking for some clues about his family's history. He had heard rumors that the hut had been built on ancestral land, but the details were vague and fuzzy. As he walked through the halls, something caught his attention. A small wooden door at the back of the house, barely visible in the shadows. Without thinking, he approached and opened it. On the other side, he found a staircase that descended into a dark, damp basement. At that moment, a strange echo echoed through the hut, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Lara stopped, her eyes widening in surprise. Was there anyone else in the cabin? The echo seemed to call out to her, as if someone was whispering her name, but when she looked around, the house was empty. A shiver ran through her body, but she decided to go downstairs, driven by a curiosity she couldn't resist. The basement was dark and cold. The light from the lamp barely shone a few feet in front of her. Lara moved slowly, the echo of her own footsteps echoing in the empty space. In the background, something glowed faintly, something that appeared to be an old, dust-covered object. He approached cautiously, and when he picked it up, he found a wooden box, old and worn, with intricate engravings on its surface. Unable to help it, Lara opened the box, and inside she found letters, photographs, and other personal belongings. As he flipped through the papers, an icy wind suddenly picked up, extinguishing the oil lamp. Darkness enveloped everything, and Lara stood still, feeling an invisible pressure begin to envelop her. It was then that she heard the first whisper clearly. "Lara?" The voice was distant but terrifying, a low wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if something was trying to communicate with her. Lara recoiled instinctively, tripping over an old chair that fell to the floor with a deafening noise. Instantly, the house seemed to come to life. The echoes multiplied, the voices intertwined, calling her, shouting her name. He covered his ears with his hands, but he couldn't block out the sound. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The air became thicker, denser, as if something was filling the space with a palpable presence. The murmur morphed into a deep, distorted voice that echoed in his ears. "Get out!" the voice commanded. But Lara couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the darkness of that basement, surrounded by echoes that never ended. At that moment, something moved in the corner of the room, a shadow that seemed to slip between the walls. Lara turned quickly, but there was nothing there. He couldn't explain it, but something told him that he shouldn't stay in that place. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the eyes of countless unseen presences were fixed on her. Her breathing quickened, and panic began to take hold of her. Suddenly, a clanging noise cut through the air. The basement door slammed shut. Lara jumped, but the pressure in the air did not disappear. A shiver ran through her body as she realized she was trapped. What had started as a visit to the cabin to discover his family's history had turned into a nightmare. Something dark and evil was present in the house, something that had been waiting for his arrival. Desperate, she began to look for a way out. He knocked on the walls, tried to open the door, but it was all useless. The presence in the house became stronger, more aggressive. The echoes of the voices turned into deafening screams, and the shadowy figure she had seen in the corner of the basement was now closer, getting closer and closer to her. Lara spun quickly, but the shadow faded before she could see her clearly. It was then that a figure appeared in front of her, emerging from the darkness. A man with a pale face and empty eyes was staring at her. Lara tried to scream, but her voice trailed off in her throat, gripped by terror. The figure wasn't moving, but his eyes reflected an endless emptiness, as if his soul had been ripped out and replaced by something much darker. The figure began to speak in a language Lara couldn't understand, but the sense of horror grew with each word she uttered. It was as if the figure was communicating with her through more than just words, as if it was touching her mind, penetrating her deepest thoughts. "Get out," the figure whispered, but Lara couldn't move a single muscle. The presence around her became denser, as if the hut itself were alive, breathing with her. Panic overflowed in her mind, but Lara couldn't do anything. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the echoes of the voices were intertwined with his own thoughts. "I don't want to die here," he thought, but it was useless. The figure stepped forward, and Lara felt an unbearable pressure in her chest. Her mind was filled with distorted images, memories of her family's past, fragments of voices and laughter that mingled with the screams that now surrounded her. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. The echoes became louder, more aggressive, as if the house itself was reacting to their presence. Lara fought to free herself, but the voices pushed her into the abyss. A sinister laugh rang in her ear, and as she turned, she saw a gigantic shadow sliding towards her. At that moment, the house seemed to explode in a burst of terror. The walls creaked, the windows shattered, and the figure in front of her disappeared in a flash of darkness. Lara fell to the ground, exhausted, struggling to breathe. But something inside him knew that he had won. It had survived the echo of the past. The cabin was located deep in a dense forest where the echo of the wind seemed to be silenced as it moved through the trees. No one bothered to come this way, and that was exactly what made the place ideal for the party they had planned. A group of friends, between laughter and jokes, had decided to get away from it all, disconnect from the noise of the city, and spend a weekend with friends. No one imagined that this choice would be the worst mistake of their lives. The cabin, although small and old, had something cozy about it. The wooden ceiling creaked under the weight of time, but the walls, though worn, seemed to have their own character. A place away from civilization, where they could do whatever they wanted without worrying about being disturbed. The arrival was simple. The car went up a steep dirt road, and when they finally arrived, they all went out in unison, eager to see the place. Laughter filled the air as they unloaded their suitcases and settled into the space. Night after night, the group became more and more relaxed. They talked about everything: old stories, anecdotes, rumors that were told about that part of the forest. But no one at the time stopped to think about the meaning of those stories. The idea that the place was marked by something strange, something they shouldn't have touched, was just superstition. That night, the temperature had dropped dramatically. The flames of the fire crackled, warming the central room where they stood. Candlelight flickered, creating shadows that danced against the walls, and laughter followed one after another, while the group played a board game without worrying about time. It was a typical winter night in the woods, but when the conversation began to wane, something in the air changed. The breeze that was once gentle transformed into a strange whisper, as if something was watching. They all felt it at the same time, like a chill running down their spine. "Did you hear that?" one of the girls asked, her voice hesitant. The others were silent, trying to catch that sound that had frozen their skin. A crunch, a whisper. Something was moving outside the cabin. "It's just the wind," one of the boys tried to reassure them, but his voice didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, the candles shook as if a gust of wind had touched them, but the windows were closed. In an instant, the darkness of the night grew denser, and the sound of the rustling branches intensified, as if the forest itself began to approach them. That's when something strange happened. The moon, which had previously been seen through the window, disappeared completely, plunging everything into impenetrable darkness. The hut, which until that moment seemed safe, now felt vulnerable, as if nature itself had ceased to protect it. "What happened to the moon?" asked a girl in a trembling voice, looking up at the sky. The darkness was so deep that not even the stars were visible. "It must be an eclipse," one of the boys suggested, but his tone didn't convince anyone. Something was not right. The feeling of being watched intensified, and a heavy weight seemed to have settled on his shoulders. The air began to grow colder, and the silence outside the cabin became deep, almost suffocating. In that silence, everyone could clearly hear their heartbeats racing and synchronized. "I'm going to look outside," said the most daring boy, Tomas. Although he wasn't entirely sure what he'd felt, something was pushing him out. Everyone fell silent as he made his way to the door, which creaked as it opened. The fog had begun to lift, darkening the surroundings even more. Thomas took a step out of the cabin, and the cold enveloped him immediately. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with a strange pressure. He looked up at the sky, but there was no moon, only a blackness so deep that it seemed to swallow everything in its path. He turned to return to the interior when suddenly he heard a whisper beside him. A low, distorted whisper, as if someone or something is calling him. He turned sharply but saw nothing. The fog enveloped him completely, making him feel trapped. "This is not right," he muttered to himself, hurrying back to the cabin. But just as he was about to take a step toward the door, he heard a low creak as if something was crawling behind him. "Thomas!" his friends shouted from inside, but he did not answer. The door closed by itself, and silence returned to the cabin. No one dared to move, but their minds were filled with questions. What had happened to Thomas? At that moment, something slipped under the door, an almost imperceptible touch that only those closest to it could hear. It was as if a shadow without any form was lurking. The darkness wasn't just outside. Now something had infiltrated inside the cabin. In the distance, one of the boys, Lucas, tried to light a flashlight, but he couldn't get it to turn on. Somehow the darkness turned it off, absorbed any attempt at light. In the distance, at the edge of vision, something moved rapidly, and a piercing scream echoed from outside. Without thinking, the group got up and ran to the window. But when they looked, they saw nothing, only more darkness. Something was stalking them, something hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the worst was not what they could see. It was what they could not see. As the hours passed, the tension in the cabin increased. Fear took hold of each of them, and soon paranoia set in. No one wanted to be alone. No one dared to go out into the dark. They were trapped. Something was stalking them, and the moon, which no longer existed, had shown them the true face of that darkness that surrounded them. But no one yet knew what was stalking them or how they could escape. All they knew was that if they didn't find a solution soon, one by one they would disappear, swallowed by the same darkness that had surrounded them that moonless night. When I moved into the house, I had no idea what I was about to experience. I had been looking for a quiet place to start over, somewhere away from the hustle and bustle of the city, somewhere that would allow me to start from scratch. After the separation, the last few months had been a chaos of decisions, paperwork, and too many visits to lawyers. Changing residence seemed like a simple solution, a way to turn my life around. And when I found the house, it was like everything had fallen into place. The house was located on the edge of a small town. It was old, one of those homes that had been there for generations, with architecture that hadn't been touched since the early 20th century. The garden was unkempt, with tall grass and vines creeping over the walls, but there was something attractive about its neglect. Perhaps it was his story that had caught my attention. For weeks I immersed myself in searching for his background, but found nothing relevant. Nothing that could have warned me of what was to come. At first, everything was perfect. The house had that cozy air that is enjoyed when everything is in its place. I spent my first few days arranging furniture, unpacking boxes, enjoying the solitude I so desired. The routine seemed calm, even comforting. But that sense of security soon began to crumble. It was on the third night that the first sign of something strange appeared. I was sitting in my living room with a glass of wine, watching television to distract myself from the tiredness of the day. The house was silent, as always. Suddenly, a slight creak made me look up. The sound came from the direction of the hallway door right in front of me. It was almost completely dark, save for the dim light coming from a table lamp near the couch. I fixed my gaze on the door. There was nothing visible, but something in the air seemed to have changed. The atmosphere was no longer calm. Something had been altered. It was a normal door, made of aged wood with a worn metal knob. In its panels, the dim light of the room was reflected, creating shadows that moved gently to the rhythm of the breeze. But suddenly something moved in the reflection. A subtle change. Something wasn't right. At first I didn't think too much about it. I thought it was my mind playing tricks due to tiredness. But as I approached the door, my reflection seemed different. It wasn't the same. My movements felt slower, as if something in the reflection was acting on its own. I thought the lighting was to blame, maybe the angle. But looking at myself again, I realized there was something else. The image in the reflection did not completely match mine. There was a slight mismatch, a shadow that didn't belong. My breathing quickened and I took a step back. I thought in my mind once again, was I getting paranoid? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching something that wasn't me. That night I went to bed with a nagging restlessness. I couldn't sleep well. Despite my fatigue, my eyes did not close completely. Every time I felt like I was about to fall asleep, a small vibration in the house would wake me up. A rustling that I couldn't identify, but that made me feel like someone was there, watching, waiting. Finally, I fell asleep, but not in one fell swoop. It was an interrupted dream, like someone was constantly waking me up. The next day, I decided to ignore what I had seen at the door. I didn't want to give too much importance to the details that could just be a product of my tired mind. But the second night, the feeling returned, this time with more force. I went to the door and stared at her. The reflection was still there, but this time it was clearer. The shadow of my reflection wasn't just subtly wrong, it was distorted, as if something else was inside my own image, something that wasn't human, something dark, a shape that glided slowly as if it were approaching through the glass of the door. I turned around immediately, my heart racing. I ran into the hallway, but there was nothing. Only the walls that whispered in the silence of the night. However, the feeling persisted. Something was stalking me. Something I couldn't see, but it was there, watching me with invisible eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours checking the corners of the house, looking for some logical explanation. But every time I passed the door, I felt like something was watching me, like something was getting closer and closer. In the end, I convinced myself that I was being irrational, but the feeling did not go away. The next few days became stranger. The reflection in the door began to show me things it didn't before. When I got closer, my image on the glass became more distorted. It began to move independently. I saw my reflection smiling, but my lips didn't move. I saw my face crumple into an expression of pain, but I didn't feel it. It was as if my reflection had a life of its own, something I had no control over. One night, I decided to face the terror that was taking over me. He would place a camera in front of the door to record what was happening. I knew that if I could see it on video, I could at least rationalize what was happening. The camera recorded what I already feared. The reflection was not just mine. There was something else. During the recording, I saw my reflection start to move erratically. My body seemed to twist, as if I was unable to control its movements. The shadow grew larger, darker, and approached me in the reflection. I saw a pair of eyes glowing in the dark behind my reflection, and then the camera caught a whisper that chilled my blood. "I'm watching you." The voice was not mine. It was soft, deep, and evil. Terrified, I looked at the door. The reflection was empty. There was nothing, just the door reflected in the glass. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I felt trapped with no way out. Days passed, and my anxiety grew. Every time I got closer to the door, I saw the figure in the reflection more clearly. He was no longer just a shadow. It was a being that fed on my fear, that got closer with every step I took. Finally, one night, I decided that I couldn't live with that presence anymore. I made the decision to leave the house. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. It was closed tightly, as if something from inside was blocking it. I hit the door with all my might, but it didn't budge. At that moment, I understood that I was not alone in that house. The being that had been watching me, that reflection, was not part of the door. It was a part of me, something that had come to life through my own fears, something that had fed on my anxiety and now kept me trapped in an endless cycle of terror. The last time I saw the reflection, the shadow was no longer just a figure. Now it had taken over my image. His eyes, those dark eyes, peered into my face as my reflection smiled at me with a macabre smile, as if I had won the battle. As I watched, I felt like I was fading, like something was slipping away from me. And in that moment, I understood that the reflection had taken my place. The door to the house remained closed, and now, every time someone passes by, they see a strange reflection in the old door. Something that doesn't belong but never leaves. And inside the house, the figure continues waiting, watching, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake as me. The party was in full swing. Colored lights shone on the walls, creating grotesque shadows that danced to the rhythm of the music. The laughter of the guests mixed with the nervous conversations, as if they all shared the same inexplicable excitement. The guests wore outlandish costumes and strange masks, but none of them looked as disturbing as the one now resting on my face. I don't remember exactly how I had come to have it, but it was there, as if it had been part of the party from the beginning. They gave it to me without a word, a porcelain mask, white as snow, with fine details on the edges and empty eyes that seemed to stare at me with an unfathomable emptiness. I took it without thinking. There was something about that mask that attracted me, something that made me feel like I couldn't reject it. At first, everything seemed normal. The party continued its course, trivial conversations, laughter, and more drinks. I looked in the mirrors from time to time, watching my face become covered behind the cold porcelain. People greeted me without paying much attention to what I was wearing, and the night progressed without further surprises. But something began to change. At first it wasn't obvious. It was just an uncomfortable feeling that came over me as I moved from one group to another. The air felt thick, heavy, as if everything around it was becoming more and more oppressive. The murmurs of conversations began to sound distorted, as if everything were shrouded in a blanket of thick fog. And then, the moment I walked up to the hallway mirror, I saw it. My reflection was not the same. The face looking out of the glass seemed altered, as if the mask was molding my face into something strange and alien. My eyes, which used to be dark, now shone with an unnatural brilliance. The lines of my face were distorted. My lips curved into a smile that was not mine. My reflection began to move on its own, as if it were a separate entity from me. I remained motionless, paralyzed by fear, watching as my reflection began to smile with an expression that was terrifying to me, foreign to my will. A chill ran down my spine and my breathing became labored. Was it the mask that was controlling me? Or was it me who was losing my sanity? What was happening to me? Restlessness grew inside me like a slow, insidious poison. I decided to leave the party. I needed to get out, take off the mask, get back to normal. But when I tried to take it off, I couldn't. The mask clung to my face with supernatural strength. I tried to pull it, to tear it, but the porcelain seemed to fuse with my skin. Each attempt to remove it was useless. The mask remained firm, as if it had always been a part of me. Desperate, I ran to the bathroom. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as the sound of the party faded away, plunged into a deep silence. Looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, horror took over me. My reflection no longer belonged to me. Now my face was completely transformed. The mask, although still in place, seemed to have merged with my face, as if there was no longer any separation between what was me and what was the mask. My skin became pale, almost translucent, and the eyes, which had once been mine, now shone with a strange, unnatural glow. The reflection smiled at me again, but this time it wasn't a distant smile. It was a malicious, mocking smile, as if he was enjoying my suffering. The feeling that something was controlling me, that I was no longer the one making the decisions, became more and more unbearable. I felt my mind begin to crumble, as if the mask was taking possession of my soul, molding me to its will. I ran towards the bathroom door, but the moment I touched it, an invisible force pushed me back. I fell to the ground, and for an instant the world around me faded away. The air grew thick, and darkness enveloped me like a heavy blanket. But when I raised my head, I saw something even more terrifying. The people at the party were no longer there. The house, which was once full of noise and life, was now empty, falling apart as if it had been abandoned for years. The walls were covered in dark stains, the lights flickered intermittently, and the floor creaked under my feet. The worst of all was that he was not alone. My reflection, that alien entity that took control of my body, walked next to me, looking at me with that same cruel smile. Fear overwhelmed me completely. but there was nothing I could do to stop it. The mask, which had previously seemed like just another accessory, was now an integral part of me, a part that I couldn't escape. I felt trapped in a foreign body, as if I no longer had control over what I did. My movements, my face, everything seemed controlled by something else. "Who are you?" I whispered, trembling. The voice that came out of my mouth was not mine. It was a strange, deep voice full of evil. It wasn't me who was talking. The mask had taken everything. My reflection approached slowly, its smile even wider, as if it were mocking me. "Who am I?" he repeated, and the voice that emerged from his mouth was not human, but something darker, something that did not belong to this world. "I am what you have become. I am what you never wanted to be." Terrified, I tried to run, but the reflection followed me. Its steps were mine. Its shadow stalked me. The hallway stretched on endlessly, and the exit door always seemed to be at an impossible distance to reach. My hands shook as they touched the walls, as if the house itself was rejecting me, as if everything around me was trying to absorb me. Suddenly a voice whispered in my ear. It wasn't my reflection, it wasn't anyone physically there, but I felt it with a terrifying intensity. "There is no way out. The mask does not come off. Now you are part of it, and it is part of you." Desperation consumed me. He no longer knew if the reality he was living was real or if everything had been a fantasy crumbled by madness. All I knew was that the mask had claimed me, that my soul was no longer mine. And as my reflection approached, its eyes shining with palpable evil, I understood that I could never escape. The house was everything I had dreamed of, spacious, old, full of history. From the moment I saw the facade, I knew I had found the perfect place to start over. After all, who wouldn't want to live in a place that breathed the past, with its large windows and high ceilings? The idea of moving into a house with so many stories to tell excited me. However, he did not know that the walls of that house hid secrets much darker than any story from yesteryear. At first, everything seemed normal. The furniture I had brought was easily arranged in the living room, the boxes were unpacked, and the house began to take on the essence of what had been my home. There was only one small problem, a strange door that was not part of the plans he had received when purchasing the property. It was hidden behind wallpaper so perfectly placed that, at first glance, it looked like just another part of the wall. Nobody had told me about that door. During the first days, I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the strangeness of an old renovation, something common in such old houses. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. Why was it there, hidden behind a layer of wallpaper? What was behind that sealed door? One afternoon, while cleaning and reorganizing, I couldn't take it anymore. The urge to know what was hidden behind that wall was too strong. Armed with a razor and almost desperate determination, I began to strip away the wallpaper. I tore it carefully, afraid of damaging the wood behind it, and soon the shape of an old door began to reveal its silhouette. The wood, aged by years, was covered in a layer of thick dust as if no one had touched it in decades. Breathing heavily, I approached the door and knocked on it. She was cold to the touch, as if she didn't belong with the rest of the house. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was watching me. But my curiosity was stronger than any irrational fear. I squeezed the knob, which turned with disturbing ease, as if it weren't sealed at all. When I opened it, a foul smell of mold and decomposing flesh hit me in the face. Inside, the darkness was almost tangible. Only a small sliver of light came in from the top, illuminating what appeared to be some kind of laboratory. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing, and my mind tried to avoid processing it, but the horror was undeniable. Glass jars, large and small, were lined up on wooden shelves that creaked at the slightest movement. The jars were filled with cloudy liquids, and inside were human remains. Hands, feet, eyes, body parts that could not belong to a single human being. I shuddered to recognize that these remains did not belong to a single body. They were fragments, as if someone had been collecting parts from many people for years. My mind began to spin, searching for answers in the chaos of that room. Each jar contained something creepier than the last: leather that had been tanned, broken bones, pieces of rotting meat. But the worst of all was not that. The worst was what was in the center of the room: a body. He was completely still, but you could see a slight shaking in his chest as if he were breathing. How was that possible? The body looked human, but something about it was completely strange. The skin was too pale, the eyes were sunken, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he was trying to say something. However, he did not move except for that irregular breathing, as if he still had some life inside him. Then I saw it. In the window, right in front of the room, was a figure. A man, or at least that's what I thought at first. He was standing, watching me from the other side of the glass with a smile on his face. It wasn't a kind or friendly smile. It was a crooked smile, like someone who knows something you don't know. His eyes were bloodshot and his skin had a grayish hue, as if he had been dead for a long time. The feeling of being watched ran down my spine, a chill so strong it made me shiver. The feeling of dread grew in me, like a wave that I couldn't stop. I didn't know if I should scream, run, or freeze. The man at the window did not move. His face was still smiling and his eyes kept looking at me. However, something told me that I shouldn't look away. Something inside me warned me. The man was not just an illusion. He was there in that place with a presence that seemed as real as I did. That's when I heard a noise behind me, a soft but ominous sound, like someone was dragging something on the ground. I turned around quickly, fear filling me completely. The body in the center of the room, the one that looked dead, had started to move. His arms stretched forward and his breathing became louder, more urgent. I felt a knot in my stomach. I wasn't alone. Something else was in that room with me. Terrified, I tried to back away towards the door, but fear had paralyzed me. I couldn't move, I couldn't think. I just wanted to get out, but my feet didn't respond. That's when the voice came. A raspy voice, as if coming from the depths of the earth, whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have opened that door." The door he had discovered, the secret room, was a place of confinement, of suffering. Something had been trapped there for years, maybe decades, and I had been the one who had released that horror. The man in the window was not just any figure. It was the guardian of that place, the presence that had been watching the entire time, waiting for someone like me, to make the mistake of opening the door. Suddenly, the body in the room took a step towards me. My body reacted reflexively and I managed to turn the door handle, launching myself out of the room. But something stopped me. A cold, thick hand grabbed my ankle. I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling, like the whole place was about to collapse. With one last effort, I managed to break free and leave the room, but when I turned my head to look back, I saw the figure of the man slowly fading into the darkness. I ran through the hallways of the house, looking for an exit, looking for fresh air. But the house didn't want to let me go. The doors closed by themselves, the windows did not open, and the feeling of being followed by something indescribable followed me at every step. The house was no longer a house. It was a trap, a place that had been waiting for someone like me to release what was there. I never went back to the house, nobody lived there again. And every time someone passes through that area, the wind brings with it a whisper, a warning. Don't open the door. The house remained standing, silent, with its secret room, waiting for its next victim. When I decided to move to the university campus, I never imagined that my life would completely change over the course of a few months. It had been a difficult transition, leaving behind the quiet life of my hometown to move to a place full of strangers, new faces, voices that mixed in the hallways of campus. But college life, with its promise of independence, adventure, and new friendships, drew me like a magnet. At first, everything seemed normal, or at least enough for me to adapt quickly. University was what I had been told, exhausting, demanding, but fascinating. My roommate, Sarah, was quiet. He was always in his corner of the room, reading or looking at his phone. We barely exchanged words, and when we did, it was to talk about the most basic things: homework, class schedules, or comments about the food in the cafeteria. Sometimes I wondered if she really lived there. So rarely did I see her do anything other than study or sleep. Being more extroverted, he asked me questions about his life, but I always diverted the conversation or simply responded with monosyllables. It didn't bother me because, at the end of the day, all I needed was someone to share the space with. I didn't care if she wasn't my best friend. It was one morning when I found her in her bed, looking out the window. He didn't move when I entered the room, and his gaze was lost, as if he were in another world. I didn't pay much attention to it at first, but something about the atmosphere made me feel uncomfortable. I went to the kitchen to make myself breakfast, and when I returned to the room, something caught my attention. A bright red stain on her sheets. It wasn't much, just a couple of drops, but the color made me stop. At first I thought it could have been something simple, like an accident with a beauty item or a food stain. But something inside me didn't let me calm down with that idea. The rest of the day passed without incident, but the stains on the sheets were still there, like a shadow I couldn't ignore. That night, I had a hard time falling asleep. Something was wrong, not just with the stains, but with Sarah. The room, which had always had a somewhat somber atmosphere, seemed heavier than ever. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the uneasiness grew with each passing second. The next day, curiosity got the better of me than my desire to ignore the matter. I decided to investigate further. When Sarah left for class, I took the opportunity to check the room. I looked at the sheets carefully, touching them cautiously, hoping to find some kind of explanation. That's when I saw something else. On the edge of the blanket, almost imperceptible, a small stain of blood, darker than the previous one, slid towards the edge of the bed. I wasn't sure what to do. The situation was becoming stranger than he imagined. At first, the only thing that prompted me to continue investigating was a vague feeling of discomfort. But the more I watched, the more I realized that what was happening with Sarah wasn't a simple accident or misunderstanding. I went to his closet, and that's where everything started to take a more sinister shape. In a closed drawer, I found a small package. Upon opening it, I found a series of strange objects: a pocket knife, a piece of torn cloth, and what looked like some kind of small diary, bound in black leather. I couldn't help but flip through it, and as soon as I did, its contents made my blood run cold. The pages were filled with disturbing writings, snippets of stories that talked about the next one, the target, the hunt, and most disturbingly, the dates coincided with the days Sarah moved to campus. I didn't understand what I was reading, but there was something about those words that chilled me. They were details about people, about young people who had disappeared, who had been hunted. At first, I tried to rationalize it, thinking that maybe it was just a horror game or a macabre fantasy. But the bloodstains and objects in his drawer told me otherwise. I decided I had to talk to Sarah. I couldn't continue ignoring the signs, but when I confronted her that night, her reaction was different than I expected. He remained silent, looking at me with a cold expression. It wasn't the Sarah I knew. Somehow he seemed like a completely different person. "I knew you'd find out one day," he said quietly, almost without emotion. That's when she told me the truth, or at least what she thought was the truth. He revealed to me that he was not who he said he was. His life had been marked by violence, by a series of dark events that he had never wanted anyone to discover. I wasn't a reserved and quiet girl by accident. Sarah had been part of a series of strange events, covert murders in her hometown for which she herself had been responsible. She had been a hunter, not in the common sense, but in a much darker one, hunting people, stalking, observing, and finally eliminating those who were chosen. She told me that she had run away to prevent her past from catching up with her, but she knew she couldn't escape what she was. Every time someone got too close, she fell into her old pattern. Her impulses dominated her, and the only way to stop them was to keep moving, to start over somewhere else where no one knew who she really was. I didn't want to believe him. Each word seemed more absurd to me than the last, but his eyes, empty and dark, told me that everything was true. At that moment, everything inside me began to fall apart. The feeling of terror was absolute. I knew I had to get out of there, but fear paralyzed me. What could I do? How could he escape from someone like her? Someone who not only knew the darkest corners of the human mind, but could also be capable of anything. Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker. I heard a noise coming from the hallway, like someone was walking towards our door. Sarah stood up slowly with a smile that wasn't a smile. It was a grimace, an expression that only those who have been touched by evil can exhibit. I felt trapped. There was no way to escape. I tried to run, but when I got to the door, it was locked. I couldn't get out. She started to get closer, and at that moment I knew I had fallen into her trap. The sound of his footsteps echoed in my head, and my breathing became increasingly difficult. The last image I saw was of Sarah smiling at me, a disturbing gesture as she approached with the knife in her hand. The knife shone under the dim light of the lamp, reflecting red light, as if everything around was dyed with blood. I couldn't do anything anymore. The door to my room, which seemed to be the last exit in my life, was closed. There was no way to escape. Fear enveloped me, and terror consumed me completely. Sarah, my roommate, was not just a student. She was the hunter, and I was simply her latest prey. It was a moonless night, the cold air cutting through the half-open window of the car. The road stretched before me like an endless tunnel of darkness. The headlights of my car were the only thing breaking the blackness, briefly illuminating the empty asphalt highway. My watch read 2:35 a.m., and I had been driving for hours without meeting a single soul on the road. My destination was a small town on the other side of the hills, but the journey was becoming endless. There was something unsettling about this deserted highway, something I couldn't place but that was slowly crawling under my skin. The trees on both sides of the road moved in the wind, but there seemed to be no life in them. There were no signs, no cars that could indicate that someone else shared that same darkness. The only thing I could hear was the constant sound of the tires spinning on the asphalt, the engine roaring through the void, and my own breathing somewhat accelerated, as the feeling of loneliness took over me more and more. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw the lights of another car. At first, I thought it was a mirage caused by fatigue, but as it got closer, the lights became more intense, more real. At first, I thought he would move out of the way, like any other driver who respects other people's space. But not. The car began to approach me with an alarming speed, too fast to be simply a coincidence. He couldn't see the vehicle clearly from where he was, but he was sure something was wrong. Anxiety took over me and I sped up a little more, but the car did not reduce its speed. It was getting closer and closer. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the lights that had almost reached me. The car was still right behind me, without deviating from the route, without stopping following me. My breathing became more erratic and my mind began to think of the most terrifying possibilities. What did he want from me? The highway seemed to have no end. The headlight of that car behind me illuminated my mirrors as if it were stalking me. My hands began to sweat, my mind tried to search for answers, but there was no logic to what was happening. My instinct told me to speed up even more, but for some reason I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me prevented me. It was as if something or someone was controlling me, directing my actions, as if the terror of the situation had paralyzed my body. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the car behind me began to slow down, keeping a safe distance away. The light of its headlights went out momentarily, and I could see the outline of the vehicle that was following me. It was dark, with no visible license plates, and it seemed to have an indistinct shape as if darkness itself had covered it. The silence was absolute, and I couldn't help but look around looking for some sign of life, some human being who could help me, but everything was empty. The road desolate, the air cold and heavy. And in the middle of all that, the car behind was still there, lurking without making a sound, without moving. Suddenly I saw what I least expected. The car drove forward and stopped right in front of me, blocking my path. My heart stopped for a moment. A cold sweat ran down my back. The vehicle's lights came on again, illuminating the interior of mine, momentarily blinding me. A man got out of the car with disturbing calm. His figure was difficult to make out, but he was in no hurry. He walked to my car as if everything was under his control, as if there was no reason to fear him. His face was in shadow, covered by the hat and long coat he was wearing. The only thing that could be seen clearly were his eyes, intense, fixed, as if they were observing me with a penetrating certainty. He reached my window and tapped it lightly, causing the glass to shake. "Do you have a moment?" he said in a soft tone, but it still made my blood run cold. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, like he was enjoying the moment. I didn't answer. My mind was chaos, full of questions and fears that I didn't want to accept. What did he want from me? Why had he been following me all this time? "Listen," he continued, without waiting for a response. "Your right rear tire is about to blow out. It is not safe to continue driving with it in this state. You better stop." My eyes widened and fear began to take over my body. What kind of madness was this? How did I know something was wrong with my car? I hadn't stopped the entire ride, and the car hadn't made any strange noises. Panic began to rise in me. What was happening? Was he a savior or something much more sinister? I squeezed the steering wheel hard, not knowing what to do. Something inside me told me to keep going, but fear kept me trapped, paralyzed in that same place. "I'll help you," the man said with a smile that, although not visible on his face, he could hear in the tone of his voice. "Just get out of the car." But I couldn't. I didn't know if it was a trap, if he was taking me to a place where I couldn't escape, or if what he said was simply true. Something wasn't right, and I knew it with every fiber of my being. My body was fighting to take control, but I couldn't. Fear had plunged me into complete paralysis. Suddenly, the man took a step back as if he had sensed my hesitation. His eyes glowed in the dark in a strange way, something I couldn't explain. Something in his eyes changed. And then I knew it. He wasn't here to help me. He wasn't warning me for my safety. He wanted me to stop. He wanted me to trust him with my life. Before I could react, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of something crawling, something coming from inside his car. Something I couldn't see but knew was there, waiting. The man smiled, and that's when I knew this wasn't just a chance encounter. He had been waiting for me, following my steps, controlling my every movement. "You have no reason to be afraid," he said, but his voice was not comforting. It was a promise, a masked threat. My breathing quickened. Suddenly, the lights of the car behind him began to flicker, and a hooded figure emerged from them, crawling unnaturally, as if his body did not belong to this world. Terror took over me completely. The figure approached slowly, as if basking in the anticipation of the moment. He could no longer look at the man, nor at the figure behind him. Everything was blurring in my mind. I could only think about escaping. I started the car hard. The engine roared, and I put it in reverse. The man shouted something, but I could no longer hear him. I just knew I had to get out of there. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, it was too late. The car and its dark figure vanished into the blackness of the road as if they had never existed. The road was empty as it had been at the beginning. He was no longer being followed. But I wasn't safe either. The man was not a savior. He wasn't someone who wanted to help me. His presence was just part of something much bigger. A trap designed to trap me, to make me part of a reality I didn't understand. Despite having escaped from him, I never stopped feeling his gaze, his presence. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel him behind me. And although he was no longer on the road, he knew that the darkness had claimed him. I never made it to town, and no one heard from me again. It was a gray day, almost as if the sky had been covered in a thick layer of fog, which not only obscured the sunlight, but also any vestige of hope that might have remained in the surrounding nature. I was walking through the forest, following a path I had known well since my childhood. The route was simple. The trees stood like silent giants, covering the path with a comforting shadow. But today, everything seemed different. Everything felt heavier, more oppressive, like the forest was about to tell me a secret I didn't want to know anything about. Suddenly, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I came across something I didn't expect, an abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for years, with its walls deteriorating and the roof sagging under the weight of time. The place not only seemed empty, but exuded a strange feeling of desolation, as if no one had set foot inside for decades. However, the door was ajar. I couldn't help but be curious, and without thinking too much, I decided to enter. The air inside was thick, almost impossible to breathe, as if every corner was permeated with the souls of those who once inhabited that space. The floor creaked under my footsteps, echoing alarmingly in such a quiet place. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to notice something disturbing. Multiple posters hung on the walls, posters with photographs of missing people. Some of those faces looked vaguely familiar. There was something disturbing about those faces, something I couldn't place at first. People of all ages, from children to the elderly, all with a fixed gaze, as if the camera had captured them at the moment of their disappearance. My breathing accelerated when I saw a sign that left me frozen. It was the photo of my own brother who had disappeared without a trace several years ago. It couldn't be. I couldn't be there. The same face, the same empty expression, the same lost look. And below, in big red letters, the message, "Missing. Nobody knows anything." The air became even heavier, and my heart began to pound in my chest. How could it be there in that dark and forgotten place, when what she wanted most was to find it? A cold sweat ran down my back. What did this mean? Why was his photo in that cabin with all the others? Who was behind these disappearances? I felt an uncontrollable urge to flee, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but something was stopping me, as if some invisible force was dragging me towards the posters, towards the photos of those who no longer existed, towards the mystery that surrounded that place. Suddenly I heard a noise, a distant creak. At first I thought it was the sound of a branch breaking due to the wind, but the feeling that I was not alone grew stronger. Every fiber of my being told me I should go, but my feet didn't respond. My mind was trapped in an abyss of terror, unable to get away from those faces, from those empty gazes. I approached a table in the center of the room, and next to it was an old notebook. Without thinking, I opened it. Inside, there was a list of names. They were all people who, like my brother, had disappeared without a trace. But the most disturbing thing was the last page, which was marked with a date. It was today. And next to the date, one more name. Mine. A chill ran through my body. I felt like I was short of breath. Someone was watching me. I turned quickly but saw nothing. Only the empty cabin, empty like the look of those who were trapped in the photos. My instinct told me that I should flee, that I should not stay in that place for another second. I took a step back, then another and another, until finally I turned to run. But when I got to the door, something stopped me. It wasn't the door, it wasn't fear, it was the sound. A low, distant whisper, like an echo coming from the forest. It was a murmur, a voice. Not one, but many voices. They seemed to be calling to me, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. However, at that moment I understood the worst. I wasn't alone. I turned, and at the edge of the door I saw a figure. A shadow that seemed to move between the trees, sliding with terrifying agility. I took a deep breath, and without thinking I ran out of the place, crossing the forest path with my heart beating in my throat. But I couldn't stop thinking about the photos, the notebook, that name that was at the end of the list. I ran without looking back until the sweat blinded me and my legs gave out. Fear enveloped me, and I felt a tightness in my chest, as if something invisible was following me, stalking from the shadows. Every creak of the branches, every murmur of the wind made me stop, afraid that the figure I had seen at the door of the cabin was now behind me. The sound of footsteps getting closer didn't let me breathe. I looked back frantically and saw him. The figure was approaching, slipping through the trees, but it was not a person. No, he wasn't human. It was something else, something that should not exist, something that fed on terror, something that had been stalking everyone who disappeared. I stopped dead when I heard a distant scream, as if someone was calling my name. But it wasn't my brother's voice. It was a voice I didn't know, deep and raspy, a voice that didn't come from a human being. The scream was repeated, this time closer. I felt my mind begin to break. I ran without thinking, without direction, just wanting to escape that presence. The branches and roots of the forest seemed to move as if they wanted to catch me, stop me. Finally, I came to a clearing. I thought I was finally safe, but when I looked up, my eyes met a sign. The same sign he had seen at the cabin. But this time, it wasn't a photo of a missing person. It was a photo of me. And on the edge, written in blood, was the message, "You can't escape anymore." The forest had won. I was just one more. The sign I had seen was my sentence, a mark that indicated that I would never leave there. Because the forest had something dark and ancient, something that did not let its victims escape. Something that took them, trapped them, made them part of its terrible collection. And now, like those who had disappeared before me, I was trapped in the same nightmare. The last sign never lies. What at first seems like just an image becomes a sentence. The abandoned cabin and its signs are nothing more than a reminder of those who can no longer leave. The forest does not forget, and while the dark figure lurking in the gloom may seem distant, it's only a matter of time before it draws closer, grabs you, and turns you into one of its shadows. There was never escape for me or for others. The photos, the names, the voices are just the beginning. Because the true terror is not in what you see, but in what is waiting for you, always in the shadows, ready to take you to where there is no return. The clock read 11:37 p.m. The city in the distance was shrouded in night fog. The street, normally filled with traffic and people, now seemed empty and deserted. Most of the restaurants were already closed, and the few delivery drivers left on the street seemed in a hurry, each looking to finish their day. You were no exception. You worked delivering food to earn a little extra money. It wasn't a job you were passionate about, but the flexible hours allowed you to do other things during the day. Plus, the pay was always good, and the tips, although variable, didn't usually disappoint. That night, the cold weather had welcomed you, and although the wind was blowing hard, your only thought was to finish quickly and return home to rest. You received a notification on your phone. It was a request. The client had chosen an isolated spot on the outskirts of the city. You decided to accept it. Deep down, You thought that maybe it would be a good opportunity to explore an area you had never visited before. After all, the payment was high, and the place, although secluded, did not seem to be that difficult to find. The address took you to an old, worn-out house that looked like it had been uninhabited for years. The gate was half open, as if someone had forgotten it on purpose. There was something strange about the way darkness surrounded the property, as if the house were not part of the real world but of some corner forgotten by time. The only thing that illuminated the path was the dim light of the streetlights, which could barely cut through the thick fog. You approached the door, the sound of your footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. When you rang the doorbell, you got no response. You were about to turn around and leave when the door opened slowly, as if an invisible hand had decided to let you in. The darkness inside the house was thick, dense, but a faint yellow glow came from a lamp in the background. The shadow of the house surrounded you, but something pushed you forward. You entered the house. The creaking of the wood under your feet was the only thing you could hear. The decoration was deteriorated. The walls were covered with thick dust. The broken windows let in drafts that seemed to whisper. At first, you thought the house had been abandoned, but as you walked forward, something in the atmosphere made you uncomfortable, as if someone was there, watching you. You stopped and looked around, but the house remained silent. Upon reaching a main room, you were greeted by a scene that made you stop in your tracks. The walls were covered with photographs, photos in which you appeared. In several of them, you were the only subject. In others, you appeared with people you didn't recognize. Some were recent, others seemed to be years old, but most disturbing of all were the details. In one of the photos, you saw yourself in front of your own house. Another showed you leaving work on any given day. There was one where you were in the park, and another that captured a moment when you were having coffee on the corner of your street. It all seemed too specific. It was like someone had been following you for weeks. Fear began to take over you, and although you tried to rationalize the situation, something deep inside you knew that you had to get out of there. But before you could move, a low, distant sound, like a whisper, stopped you. It came from a room at the end of the hallway. You slowly moved towards the source of the sound. As you entered, the light from the lamp flickered, and on a table in the center of the room, you found a notebook. It was no ordinary notebook. Its cover was made of a worn and old material, almost as if it were made of human skin. Fear made you hesitate, but in the end, the urge to discover more made you move closer. You opened it, and as you turned the pages, the secrets they contained terrified you. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes in irregular, often illegible handwriting. However, what struck you the most were the descriptions. Each page seemed to tell the story of your life, but from a perspective you couldn't understand. They recounted moments from your childhood that no one else knew. There were intimate details that only someone close to you would know. But there was something else. The notebook contained instructions, addresses, and schedules, as if someone had been planning your every move. Suddenly, a feeling of pressure began to take over your chest. Footsteps were heard behind you. You turned around quickly, but there was no one there. However, the atmosphere in the room had changed. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was breathing. You could feel something watching you, something you couldn't see, but it was there, lurking in the shadows. The door slammed shut behind you, and the lights in the room began to flicker brighter. Fear turned to panic. You ran towards the exit, but as you crossed the threshold, something stopped you. On the wall near the door was one last photograph. In it you appeared, just at the moment you ran out of the room. It was as if they were waiting for you, as if they already knew what you were going to do. You managed to get out, but the cool night air didn't ease the fear you felt. You quickly got into your car and started the engine with shaking hands. When you looked in the rearview mirror, a shiver ran through your body. There was no one behind you. However, on the window glass, one last image appeared, your own face in the dark, eyes wide open. Something had been watching you the whole time. As you continued down the road, the sound of the car's engine seemed to fade into the distance. Darkness surrounded you, and even though you knew you were far from that house, the fear was still palpable. Something else was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And the question that tormented you now was the same one you had asked yourself at the beginning. Who was behind all this? The answer, although you never got it, would haunt you for the rest of your days. The fog had taken over the city that afternoon, a thick, dense blanket that covered everything in its path, erasing shapes and blurring the boundaries between what was real and what was not. No one knew exactly where it had come from, but it was evident that it was no ordinary fog. Its presence was unnatural, as if the city itself was being absorbed by something much larger, something darker. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the air itself had become denser, harder to breathe. But in the middle of that fog, a man walked alone through the streets aimlessly, with the feeling of being watched, although he could not see anything clearly. He walked hoping to find something familiar, something that would give him a little comfort in that impenetrable fog. The lights of the streetlights were diffuse, like floating ghosts in the darkness. I couldn't hear anything, not even the footsteps of the few passers-by who might be nearby. Everything was enveloped in absolute silence, as if the world had ceased to exist beyond the fog. As he turned a corner, he stopped suddenly. A figure loomed vaguely in front of him, almost floating in the mist. But what caught his attention most was the feeling that that figure was watching him. However, he couldn't make out any faces, only a fuzzy human form. He felt an inexplicable discomfort, as if something was wrong, as if the figure didn't belong there. The figure, who seemed to be waiting for something, took a step towards him. And then he heard it. A voice, soft and familiar but strangely empty. It was a voice that sounded familiar to him, as if he had heard that same voice somewhere else at some other time. But he didn't recognize her. "I've been waiting for you," the figure said in an almost melancholy tone. The man frowned and took a step back. His heart began to beat faster, a thud in his chest that echoed in his ears. The fog closed in around him, tightening his breathing, as if the entire city was watching his every move. The figure took another step towards him, but did not seem to physically advance. Instead, the distance between them shrank unnaturally, as if space was twisting around them, and the voice continued to resonate, familiar but at the same time strange. "Don't you remember me?" the figure insisted, almost as if she were toying with him, as if she knew a secret that he didn't yet understand. He felt confused, unsure of what was happening. That voice, it sounded too familiar, like it was connected to something deep inside him. He took another step back, desperately searching for a way out, but the fog seemed to close in more and more. The figure took another step towards him, and as he did, the air grew heavier, thicker, as if each word the figure said was filling the air with something dark, something ominous. I don't know who you are," the man replied, his voice shaking, though he tried to sound firm. "I don't recognize you." The figure smiled, although it was not a human smile. It was a vacant smile, looking more like a grimace, as if the skin was being stretched beyond its natural limits. And at that moment, the man noticed something strange. The figure did not move naturally. His every movement was erratic, almost as if he were struggling to take shape, as if the fog itself was warping his figure. Something inside told him that he shouldn't be there. Something was terribly wrong. "Maybe you don't remember me," the figure said, but his tone changed. Now it was much deeper, darker, as if there was something that couldn't be pronounced. "You may not remember your name, where you've been, or what you've done, but I do remember. I know what you are." The man stepped back, his body on high alert. He could feel the fog surrounding him, as if it were beginning to crush him, as if he were being sucked in slowly, inexorably. The figure took another step towards him, and he tried to take a step back, but he couldn't move. It was as if the fog was holding him, trapping him. I could no longer distinguish shapes, lights, or shadows. Everything had turned white, blurry, as if it had fallen into an endless void. "No," he muttered, more to himself than the figure. "This can't be real." But the figure did not hear him. He was too close now, too close. His face was no longer a human face. But what frightened him most was not his appearance, but the feeling that he knew him. The fog seemed to be absorbing everything that existed, everything he knew, and leaving a void, an abyss in its place. The figure came even closer, and its voice, which no longer sounded human, echoed in his mind. "Everything is about to end. No matter what you try, everything repeats itself. Everything you are, everything you have done has already happened before. We have already seen it. We have already been here." At that moment, the man could not contain his panic. The fog enveloped him completely, and fragmented memories flashed through his mind, flashes of moments in his life, but they all crumbled, twisted, and became unrecognizable. No matter what he tried, he couldn't escape. The figure knew him, and he didn't recognize her. The figure spoke one last time, and its voice was an icy whisper that passed through his entire being. The meeting in the mist is only the beginning. And in that moment, something broke inside him. The fog enveloped him completely, and the city disappeared. There was no sky, there was no sun, there was no life. Just an empty space, a void without form or time, where the shadows stretched infinitely, where the fog never stopped flowing. The man was no longer alone. I wasn't lost, he had been before. The man never got up again. Nobody looked for it, nobody waited for it. The fog disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, and the city returned to its normal state, as if nothing had happened. But deep in the fog, in that place where time and space mixed and disappeared, something was still waiting. The figure watched from the shadows, watching the cycle repeat itself, as it always did. The fog always returned, bringing with it the encounter, and he was never the same again. The man had fallen into the fog's trap, and with him the cycle closed once again, awaiting a new visitor. It was a quiet night, the typical afternoon when the city seemed to be a distant echo of everything that really mattered. The gentle breeze drifted through the open window of Javier's small apartment. It wasn't a big or luxurious place, but it was enough for him. The important thing was the peace I felt at the end of each day, the comfort of being home after long hours of work. It had been an exhausting week, full of stress and endless tasks at the office. That night, he decided to relax, disconnect, and enjoy his nightly ritual, the radio. The sound of the radio always accompanied him, his favorite station, the one he used to listen to relax while reading a book or simply resting. It was something every day, a background noise that was already part of his life. At that moment, Javier lay down on his couch, the volume of the radio low, just enough for the melodies to fill the atmosphere. The soft light of the lamp on the table gave a cozy air to the room, while the city, oblivious to everything, continued its course. But that night, something changed. Something I would never have imagined. The song started playing unexpectedly, interrupting the usual music coming from the speaker. It wasn't a melody he recognized, not even one that sounded familiar. At first, Javier thought it was one of those weird songs that they occasionally played on the radio for a change, but as the melody progressed, something began to bother him. The singer's soft, ethereal voice seemed to whisper words that at first seemed to be just random lyrics. But soon Javier realized that something was not right. The lyrics were strangely precise, too specific. The first line said, "Since you woke up this morning, the city watched you in silence." Javier frowned, feeling something running down his back like a cold current. The song continued, but the feeling of discomfort took over him little by little. The lights in your window go out, while the clock strikes the last hour. Javier's pulse increased. The singer's voice continued to resonate, and the feeling of discomfort grew with each word. I couldn't look away from the speaker. Something was happening, but I didn't know what. He was sure he had never heard that song before, but somehow, he felt like the words spoke directly to him, as if they were describing his life, his present. The wind comes through the window and the clock keeps counting, but this time it won't wake you up. Javier sat suddenly on the couch, looking at the radio with half-closed eyes, almost in disbelief. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be a coincidence. The details, each line, seemed to be reflecting his life, his daily routine. But the worst was yet to come. The song continued with a haunting progression. The words seemed more personal, more detailed. The empty street, your footsteps echoing, but no one will see what is already written. Javier stood up from the couch, his mind racing aimlessly, not understanding what was happening. The lyrics couldn't be about him. True? Somehow the words wouldn't stop hammering in his head. The worst, the most terrifying, was yet to come. The voice on the radio seemed to anticipate something, and as the melody progressed, the lyrics slowly tore through him. The door you closed when you left will never open again, and that song will be your last breath. Javier's face turned pale. What did that mean? Fear settled in his chest, cold, heavy. Every word resonated with terrifying accuracy. His mind began to make connections, but anxiety clouded his judgment. He walked over to the radio and turned up the volume to hear better, not knowing if he wanted the song to end or if he wanted the answers to come once and for all. The lyrics continued, but it was no longer just a description of his life. It was as if the song was narrating the last moments of his existence. The path you take, the last station, there is no return, only the echo of time. Why are you saying this? Javier murmured in a low voice, feeling how fear gripped him. I couldn't stop listening. The melody, although sad, seemed to offer him a kind of strange calm, but the lyrics were like a sentence, and with each word he felt that he was getting closer and closer to what the song described. The last call you receive will no longer be the last, because there will be no one on the other end of the phone. Javier stepped back, as if the air had become thick, impossible to breathe. Something wasn't right. Was it a macabre joke? A trick of some kind? The song couldn't be an accident, it couldn't just be a coincidence. His heart was pounding, each word sending him deeper into panic. And then the song reached its climax. The singer's voice sounded like a whisper through the radio, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, enveloping Javier in a feeling of unease. The end is near, the air stops, and when the last note falls, your body will fade away without anyone noticing. Javier couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. The song had stopped playing, but his mind continued to play the words over and over again like an endless echo. His breathing became labored, and the feeling that something inevitable was about to happen overwhelmed him. He couldn't understand what was happening, why that song had appeared on his radio, and why the words seemed to preach his death. Suddenly the clock on the table rang, and the silence that had filled the room became even heavier. Javier looked towards the door. A shudder ran through his body. He didn't want to leave, he didn't want to face what was coming. But something inside him, something instinctive, told him that he couldn't stay there. Fear was consuming him, and the radio had left a mark on his soul that he couldn't erase. Javier left the apartment, desperate, looking for answers, looking for something to get him out of that nightmare. But as he walked down the street, something strange happened. The city lights began to flicker, and the air became heavy as if time itself had changed. The feeling that something was lurking, waiting, enveloped him. It was as if everything he had heard in that song was coming to life in his surroundings. When he reached the intersection of the street, the traffic lights flashed and the world seemed to stop. At that moment, a car appeared at high speed, and Javier, trying to cross, did not have time to react. The song he had heard on the radio, the one that described his life and death with such precision, came true. The last note of the melody rang in his mind, and then everything faded into darkness. The next morning, no one remembered exactly what had happened. The radio was still in its place, silent as always. But in some dark corner of the world, the song was still being broadcast, waiting for its next victim. Because sometimes, there are predictions that cannot be avoided. From the beginning, everything seemed normal. A quiet walk in the forest where the sun filtered its rays through the treetops, illuminating the dusty path. The fresh air, mixed with the smell of wet earth, enveloped you in a feeling of peace. That day I had decided to disconnect from the chaos of the city and enter the calm of the forest, seeking mental clarity. Just me, my thoughts, and nature. The path was lonely, as expected. I wasn't surprised to find myself alone. Most people avoided solitary walks, and I was never one to follow crowds. As he walked down the path, the sounds of the forest filled the space. The birds were singing, the leaves rustled under my steps, and the wind rustled through the trees. However, something began to change. At first, it was subtle. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. A whisper, barely audible, seemed to call me. I couldn't make out the words, but I clearly heard my name. At first, I attributed it to the wind, which can sometimes create auditory illusions. But then I heard it again, a whisper in the breeze. Daniel. I stopped dead. I looked around, searching for some sign, some logical explanation. The forest was silent except for the familiar sounds of nature. I laughed nervously, thinking maybe it was my imagination, and continued my walk. But the whisper repeated itself, this time louder, clearer. Daniel. This time I couldn't ignore it. I turned toward the sound, searching in the gloom that was beginning to grow between the trees. The sunlight was fading rapidly, and the forest was beginning to take on a darker, denser hue. I decided that maybe someone was playing with me, but seeing no one around, the uncomfortable feeling grew. Still, something inside me urged me to continue, to go deeper into the darkness. Each step he took towards the source of the voice seemed heavier, as if the air became denser with each meter traveled. The shadows in the forest stretched and twisted, not in a natural way, but with an unnatural fluidity, as if they had a life of their own. Every tree I passed seemed to be watching me, its branches moving in sync as if they were watching me. Daniel. The voice was now unmistakable, feminine, warm, as if it knew my soul. The intrigue pushed me to continue, although a feeling of terror was beginning to settle in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but something inside me told me that I had to continue, that I had to find out where those whispers were coming from. My steps became more hesitant, but the need to find the source of the voice became more urgent. The shadows of the trees began to move, increasingly erratic, as if responding to my presence. The ground beneath my feet was no longer solid, the roots reaching up like hands trying to catch me. The air grew colder, and the previously soft wind now carried with it an almost deafening murmur. Suddenly, a new sensation came over me. A pressure in my chest, as if something was watching me from beyond the shadows. The feeling of being watched was palpable. I stopped, fear beginning to take over my body, and looked around. The shadows no longer just moved, but seemed to have shapes, humanoid figures that emerged from the trees sliding towards me. But he couldn't see their faces, only the blurry silhouettes that faded as quickly as they appeared. "Daniel." The voice called me again, now from the depths of the forest, beyond the shadows that now seemed to be living. This time the voice was not warm or kind, but disturbing, as if someone was manipulating my mind to follow a path it should not take. And yet I couldn't help it. Something inside me urged me to continue, as if I no longer had control over my own actions. The forest became darker, the shadows denser, and the whisper became a scream, a desperate call, as if the earth itself was demanding something of me. The floor seemed to vibrate with every step I took, and voices multiplied, whispering my name but also murmurs from others, muffled, distorted voices that spoke of things I didn't understand, but that filled me with an indescribable discomfort. At that moment, something in my mind snapped. Panic overflowed like a wave. I tried to back away, but my feet didn't respond as expected. The forest had trapped me. It was no longer just a physical place, but a presence that had taken over me, that played with my deepest fears. The shadows now formed figures that seemed to be stretching towards me, lengthening, growing, as if the forest itself wanted to devour me. "Daniel." The voice echoed in my ears, louder than ever, full of desperation, as if it were coming from everywhere. I felt the pressure of something invisible on my chest, as if a cold hand was squeezing my heart. Suddenly, the air became thick, and the ground beneath my feet began to give way. I stumbled and fell to the ground, and for a moment I felt like I was falling endlessly. Panic had taken me completely, but the scream continued, incessant, a lament that pierced my soul. When my body finally hit the ground, everything stopped. The voices, the shadows, the fear. Everything disappeared in the blink of an eye. And then, as if it were a distant echo, I heard a final whisper. "You are here." The forest, now dark and silent, seemed to have swallowed everything. I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking, my mind still clouded with terror. Looking around, he no longer recognized the place. The trees, once familiar, now looked strange, misshapen. I felt as if time had stopped, or worse yet, as if I had been dragged to another plane of existence. In the end, the forest had called me and I had answered. But it was not the same forest that he had walked through at the beginning. The shadows that slipped between the trees were no longer passing figures, but entities that watched, waited. The forest was no longer a refuge, it was a prison, and I was one of its prey. The worst came when, looking back, I saw something I couldn't understand. My own reflection, distorted and dirty, was staring at me from one of the trees. But it wasn't just a reflection, it was something else. Something that followed me. And suddenly, I understood the terrible truth. The voices that had called me were not a mistake. They were not a product of my mind. He was being dragged towards something he couldn't understand, towards something he had been waiting a long time for. He had heard the call of the forest, and now the forest wouldn't let me go. The figure that followed me was my own shadow, a shadow that had taken on a life of its own and would haunt me until the end of my days. No matter how hard I tried to run, the forest had claimed me. The trees, the shadows, the wind, everything came together in an eternal cycle of terror where my soul was trapped, condemned to travel the same paths, to listen to the voices that called me over and over again. An endless, macabre game. I never left the forest. It was midnight when I decided to take the train. He was alone in the station. A cold air swept through the place, and the lights flickered intermittently, casting disturbing shadows on the walls of the station. In the distance, I heard the sound of a train approaching, a low, deep noise that echoed in my ears. My watch read 12:01 when the train arrived with a ghostly whisper, the doors opening before me as if they were waiting for me. I went up without thinking too much. The station was deserted and the train seemed to be my only option. The car was empty, except for a couple of people sitting quietly. I decided to choose a seat near the window, seeking the solace of watching the city move away. But I soon realized that something was not right. The passengers did not move. They didn't speak. Everyone was completely silent. There was something strange about their faces, as if they were frozen in time, as if they weren't really human. His empty eyes seemed to be lost in nothingness. I looked around, looking for a reaction from anyone, but there was nothing. The feeling that something was not right came over me. The train began to move. There was no usual sound of wheels on the tracks, just the dull murmur of the engine. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. I tried to ring the bell to call the driver, but the sound of the train and my own pulse merged into a strange echo. Nobody moved or reacted. The people were still in their state of lethargy. The carriage was strange. The atmosphere became thick as it advanced. I looked out the window and saw nothing but darkness. There were no lights, no other stations, no indication that the train was anywhere real. The tracks extended to infinity, and time seemed to dissolve. There was no change in the landscape, just absolute darkness, as if the train had been sucked into an endless void. My anxiety grew with every second. I tried to get up and walk towards the front of the car, but something was preventing me from moving, a heavy feeling in my legs as if it were trapping me. Every time I took a step, the environment around me became more oppressive. The atmosphere thickened, and the air became heavier. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the carriage. It was a man with an expressionless face, wearing a dark jacket. He was walking slowly towards me, and although his face was covered in shadow, I could feel his gaze fixed on me, as if he knew something wasn't right. I didn't say anything. My throat was closed, and my breathing became more labored. When he reached my side, he simply stopped without saying a word, without moving, like a living statue. The train continued moving aimlessly. The speed was the same, but time seemed to have stopped. I looked at the other passengers, all motionless, some with their eyes closed, others staring into space, but none of them reacted. A couple of minutes later, the man disappeared into the hallway, as if he had never been there. Fear took hold of me, and a feeling of claustrophobia began to take over my body. I couldn't move freely. The air became thick and cold, and the train seemed to have no end. I looked out the window, but the darkness outside was deeper than ever. I tried to open the car door, but it was sealed. I shouted, but there was no response. It was as if everything were immersed in a deep lethargy, a deathly stillness. Little by little, I began to notice something strange. The people on the train were not normal. The passengers were still there, but something about their behavior disturbed me. Although they seemed to be motionless, their eyes were moving. They moved slowly from side to side, but their bodies did not move. It was as if their souls were trapped, condemned to be there, unable to react. The sensation of being surrounded by inanimate figures filled me with panic. I wanted to run away, but I didn't know how. I approached the driver, who was in the cab, but what I saw made me stop in my tracks. The driver had no face. Instead of a face, there was only an empty white mask. His body was rigid, completely motionless, and his hands rested on the steering wheel with mechanical precision, as if it were a machine, an automaton. I stared at the mask and felt an icy current run through me. The driver was not human. There was nothing human on that train, human on me. I tried to find some logical explanation. Maybe he was dreaming, maybe he had fallen into a state of delirium from exhaustion. But something inside me knew this wasn't a dream. It was real, and he was trapped in a place he couldn't escape. The train's lights began to flicker violently, and darkness took over the car, obscuring everything in its path. I tried to scream again, but my voice drowned in a murmur. A few seconds later, everything was silent. Neither the train, nor the passengers, nor the driver made the slightest sound. He was completely alone in the darkness. The train continued moving aimlessly, and fear consumed me completely. Something was wrong with this place. Something he couldn't understand. My mind was beginning to collapse under the pressure of uncertainty. I looked around, searching for a way out, something to help me understand what was happening. But all I saw was an infinite void, an endless darkness that seemed to swallow the train. At that moment, I understood that I couldn't escape. The train was a prison, and I was condemned to ride it forever. There was no destination, there was no stop, just an endless journey towards nothingness. And worst of all, the passengers, those motionless figures, were nothing more than echoes of who they once were, trapped in an eternal routine that would never end. Finally, the train stopped. There were no signs of it arriving at a station. The doors opened, but there was no further, just a black abyss. It was not a train, nor a trip. It was an endless cycle, an eternal damnation. And then I understood the truth. All those who board the last train never return. They are condemned to stay there forever, trapped in an endless journey into darkness, with their souls lost in an endless labyrinth. I had boarded that train, and now I was one of them. One more passenger trapped in oblivion, never able to get off. The road stretched endlessly like a deep scar in the landscape, a wound in which the horizon seemed to fade into an abyss. Carlos looked ahead with his hands firmly gripped on the steering wheel, his pale face reflecting a mixture of tiredness and growing restlessness. It was the third time he had been on this same stretch, on this same road, and something wasn't right. I had already traveled hundreds of kilometers, and I still couldn't see the end. Each curve, each straight line returned an immutable landscape, as if the entire world had decided to lock itself in an endless spiral. He had left the city at 7 p.m., driven by the need to escape the pressures of everyday life. The thought of a long drive down a lonely road appealed to him, a way to find peace and serenity in his hectic mind. At first, the trip was everything I expected. The quiet of the night, the car lights cutting through the darkness, the radio playing old songs that mixed with the sound of the engine. But now, after hours, it was starting to feel strange. Every time I looked at the clock, the hours seemed to have stretched, as if time were the first spectator of a play that would never end. From time to time, I would see a road sign, always the same: keep going. But nowhere did he see the end of the road. The first time he noticed it, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe fatigue was playing tricks on him. However, as the kilometers passed, he realized that something was not right. The same desolate landscape, the same signs, and the same feeling of being trapped. He stopped for the first time on the side of the road. The car let out a lone horn as if protesting the arrest. Carlos got out of the vehicle, observing the surroundings, an arid field, covered in brown earth that stretched as far as the eye could see, without a single plant. Not a tree, not a rock to break the monotony of the landscape. In the sky, an orange moon illuminated the void, but there were no stars. In the background, the lights of the road seemed to fade into a thick fog that slid across the asphalt. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. I was sure I hadn't been there before. The road never seemed to change, never seemed to move forward, and that feeling of déjà vu began to consume him. He returned to the car and started the engine again, determined to continue. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw something strange. In the glass, something was moving in the distance. He couldn't see it well, but something, or someone, was there. Carlos's heart began to beat faster. He looked in the side and rear mirrors, but there was nothing. He pressed the pedal and lunged forward. As I drove along, the traffic signs began to change. The first time it was just a small difference. Move on became you can't go back. Carlos frowned but continued ignoring him. But then the signs became more specific, more personal. Don't forget, Carlos. The second time he saw them, his heart skipped a beat. He looked again, making sure he hadn't read it wrong. It couldn't be. Nobody knew his name here. There was no one else on this road, nor in the world. He didn't turn back. The car continued its journey, faster now, as if it could escape from that invisible presence that was stalking it. However, with every kilometer, the road seemed to become more claustrophobic. In the distance, the horizon line stretched in a strange way, as if the distances were less significant, as if the road had no end. Through the car window, he saw a figure on the side of the road. He stopped abruptly, the car screeching to a stop, and a feeling of terror enveloped him. At first, he thought it was a person, but as he got closer, something didn't add up. The figure was tall but faceless, without defined details. Just a shadow that seemed to move in a rhythm that didn't match the wind. Carlos could not move, paralyzed by a fear that kept him immobile, trapped in his own car. The figure raised an arm slowly, pointing towards him. The hand seemed to lengthen, distorting, as if it were part of a dark dream. Then the figure disappeared. Carlos couldn't take it anymore. He accelerated the car. He didn't know if he was running towards something or running away from what he had already seen. The seconds seemed like hours, and each curve plunged him deeper into madness. On each straight line, I saw the same desolate landscape, the same shadows that lengthened with each turn. The signs multiplied, no longer just warnings. Don't forget about her. You will never get out. She's waiting for you. A lump in his throat choked him. Finally, he saw what looked like a city in the distance. The lights glowed dimly, but they seemed closer than ever. He didn't think twice and accelerated even more, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could find a place to stop, to get out of this hellish spiral. When he reached the city gates, the feeling of relief was momentary. I was about to escape. As he got out of the car, he felt the cool night air. The place seemed normal, but something about the atmosphere didn't fit. The houses seemed empty, the streets deserted, as if everything was on pause. Carlos walked through the shadows with the feeling of being watched. The city, which had previously seemed like the way out, now felt like another trap. A streetlight flickered, and when he looked back toward the center of the square, he saw her. The same faceless figure was there, motionless, waiting for him. What are you?" Carlos murmured, his voice cracking with fear. The figure raised his hand once more, pointing to a building in the background, whose door opened on its own. A gust of icy wind hit his face. Carlos knew he had to go in. I had no other option. The door closed behind him with a bang. Inside the building, a dark room awaited him. But he was not alone. The walls were full of images. Blurry photos of moments in his life, and among them he saw a photo that made his blood run cold. An image of him, sitting in the car, looking ahead, while a pair of hands rested on his shoulder. Hands that had never been there. Fear washed over him again, this time with devastating force. He looked up and saw a figure reflected in the mirror. He himself was there, but his gaze was empty, distant, as if he were someone else. The door he had closed behind him began to open, but he couldn't turn back. Something kept him there, trapped in the reflection of an endless nightmare. The signs had warned him. Time was up. The last trip was already completed. The ringing of the phone echoed in the empty house. It was far from the city, in an old house by the lake. The wind gently hit the windows, and the wood creaked every time the breeze slipped through the cracks. I had decided to go there to escape the noise and hustle and bustle of daily life, seeking rest and tranquility. However, the calm that initially seemed comforting began to become unsettling. The phone rang again, and at first I didn't pay much attention to it. I wasn't expecting any calls, and the only reason I had come here was to disconnect. But something about the repetition of that sound made me stand up and walk over to the table where the phone rested. When I took it, a strange feeling ran through my body, a feeling that something was wrong. I picked up the receiver, and before I could say anything, a voice whispered on the other end of the line, "I'm in." My heart jumped in my chest. The whisper was so clear, so close. I looked around, but there was no one. My eyes scanned every corner of the room, but everything seemed in its place. The lamp, the sofa, the walls covered in old paintings. Nothing had changed. I placed the phone on the table and tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a joke, a wrong call. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something in the tone of that voice, something in the calmness of his whisper, made me feel that this was not a simple joke. I decided to go down to the basement. The house had an old basement, a room that had always seemed a bit gloomy to me, but at that moment seemed like the only place where I could find any answers. As I descended the stairs, my mind kept repeating the same phrase. "I'm in." Who could have said that? What did it really mean? The basement was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of damp. Every step I took seemed to echo in the void, and the sound of my feet on the wooden steps was the only noise that accompanied my rapid breathing. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found myself facing a solid wooden door that had been closed for years. I opened it carefully, hoping to find something that would give me a logical explanation. But when I looked inside, I only saw more darkness. My hand shook as I raised the flashlight. The light wavered in the darkness, creating shadows that danced against the walls. As I moved forward, a feeling of tightness took over my chest. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put a name to that feeling, but it was like the house was alive, like it was watching me. I stopped in front of an old chair in the center of the room. It was empty, but I couldn't stop looking at it. I didn't remember having seen her there before, and yet at that moment she seemed to be waiting for me. Suddenly the phone rang again. The sound shook me and I turned around quickly, trying to find the source of the noise. I walked blindly, my flashlight briefly illuminating the walls, the old furniture covered in dust. But there was nothing that gave me a clear explanation. The phone kept ringing, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, as if it were right behind one of the walls. I ran toward the stairs, pulse racing, but the feeling of being watched followed me. Upon reaching the first floor, I went to the phone, hoping that the call had stopped, but it didn't. I picked up the receiver and instantly I heard the same voice, closer than ever. "I'm in." My blood ran cold as I heard those words, which now seemed to come from somewhere inside the house, as if someone was whispering right behind me. But as I looked around, there was no one. Little by little, I was filled with a mixture of panic and desperation. What was happening? Who was behind this call? I couldn't believe it was all a coincidence. Something about this house wasn't right, and it was becoming increasingly clear that something or someone was stalking me. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A rustle behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but the feeling that I wasn't alone became unbearable. The voice on the phone whispered once again, "I see you." Cold sweat ran down my back. The feeling of being watched intensified. I turned quickly but saw nothing. Just the reflection of the flashlight's light on the empty walls of the house. My breathing became labored as I made my way toward the exit door. I ran into the hallway, phone still in hand. I didn't want to stay another minute in that house. But before reaching the door, the sound of the knocking stopped. Instead, I heard a distant murmur, as if someone was speaking quietly, but the words were unintelligible. The air became heavy. The walls seemed to draw closer slowly, as if the house was squeezing my chest with every breath. The lights began to flicker, and the sound of footsteps, slow and shuffling, reached my ears. I glanced at the front door, which now seemed to close on its own. Something invisible stood between my exit and freedom. The phone in my hand rang again. Desperate, I picked up once again, but this time the voice did not whisper. Instead, a dry, hollow laugh echoed in my ears. "It's too late." I turned sharply, my legs shaking under the weight of fear. At the threshold of the hall, standing there, was the figure of a person, motionless, watching me. The pale skin, the empty eyes, and the mouth twisted into a macabre smile. There was no shadow to cover it. It was there, inside my house, as if it had always been there. The figure advanced slowly, and the phone, which I still held in my hand, slipped from my fingers, falling to the ground with a dull thud. The laughter stopped, and a terrifying calm settled in the air. I became paralyzed, my legs unable to move. The figure raised a hand pointing at me, and that's when I understood. The house, the telephone, the voice, everything that had happened was perfectly orchestrated. The call he had received was not just a warning. It was an invitation. "Now you're in." The figure took another step. The air became thick, and the light went out immediately. The darkness enveloped me like a heavy cloak, and in the midst of that darkness I could hear the final whisper that came from the back of my mind, from the house itself, from the figure before me. "Welcome to your home." And then, nothing more. The figure never disappeared. The house, my house, had now become the prison of my thoughts, the prison of my fear. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, I can hear the sound of the phone ringing, followed by the familiar whisper. But there is no escape now. There is no way out anymore. What began as a call from within ended up being the beginning of an eternal cycle, a cycle from which there is no return. Night hung over the service station, a dark blanket that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The gas station, located on the outskirts of the city, was isolated, a place where only vehicles that needed to refuel and those seeking shelter on the lonely road usually stopped. The sound of the wind howling through the nearby trees and the faint glow of the yellow lights were the only things that broke the silence of the early morning. I was on the night shift, the worst of all. The monotony of those endless hours had been numbing my senses. The shadows in the corners of the store seemed to lengthen and disappear as the minutes dragged by, and the few customers who came left only a smell of cigarette smoke and bitter coffee. In the distance, the sound of some nocturnal animal broke the stillness of the night. Suddenly, the sound of the door being flung open, and 3 figures gliding like dark shadows into the gas station. There was no greeting or polite word, just the heavy thud of boots on the cement floor. The men entered with an eerie calm, as if they were familiar with the place, as if they knew exactly what they came to do. "This is a robbery," said one of them, a thick-built man with a black mask covering his face. The pistol in his hand glistened in the dim light. A shiver ran down my spine as my body tensed instinctively. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it always felt different when you were the one in the middle of the situation. Panic was like a tide, slowly rising from the depths of my stomach. "Give me the money, quickly," said another of the men, thinner, with a threadbare jacket that almost seemed to fall off his body. His voice trembled slightly, as if the situation was affecting him as much as it was affecting me. But something wasn't right. There was something in his gaze, something erratic, something that told me that the danger of a common robbery was not alone. Anxiety grew in my chest, not just because of the gun, but because of that unmistakable feeling that something much worse was approaching. I tried to stay calm, remembering that the important thing was not to make sudden movements. I walked slowly towards the register, my eyes on the three men. The air was thick, as if the darkness had taken a strange hold on everything it touched. It was at that moment that I heard the first strange sound, a dull, almost inaudible noise coming from outside, a creaking sound, as if something heavy was moving in the darkness. I froze for a moment, but the men didn't seem to have heard. "Quickly, damn it!" shouted the tallest of them, the one with the black mask, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. My hand shook as I opened the cash register. The sound of metal colliding with bills was music of horror to my ears. The money was placed on the counter, and just when I thought the nightmare might end at that moment, the noise returned, this time louder, closer. The three men stopped as if a bad omen had struck them at the same time. Their gaze shifted to the door, their faces tense and alert. I felt a knot in my stomach. There was something else, something I wasn't seeing, something that made them as nervous as it made me. Suddenly, the gas station light flickered, flickering as if the electricity was being absorbed by some foreign force. It was only for a second, but that second was enough for us all to look at each other, realizing that we were not alone. "What the devil?" one of the men murmured, a whisper of uncertainty. I couldn't help but look outside, as if the sound of the trees moving could be a simple breeze, but the air was completely still. Then the man in the black mask took a step towards the door. "Let's go quickly," he ordered hoarsely, but something had changed in his tone. He was no longer just a robber thief. He was a man who knew something worse was to come. They tried to run towards the exit, but just as they were about to cross the door, a deafening sound paralyzed them, a low, deep roar, as if the ground itself were tearing apart. The gas station lights flickered again, this time more violently, and the air became thick, oppressive. The men retreated in terror. One of them fell to the ground, carried away by the panic that took hold of everyone. "What's that?" shouted the man at the entrance, looking towards the horizon as if he expected to see a monstrous figure emerge from the shadows. I couldn't respond. My body didn't respond. My mind just repeated over and over, "Don't look outside. Don't look outside." But the fear was too great. The curiosity was stronger. The door to the gas station creaked, and as I looked, I saw a dark silhouette approaching at high speed. It was a human figure, but it was not human. The creature was crawling, moving in a way I couldn't understand. His arms were long, too long, and his face was covered by a layer of dense shadows that did not allow us to see beyond his eyes, which shone with a terrifying intensity. Panic gripped all three men at the same time. They screamed, they pushed each other, but they couldn't get out. They couldn't escape. I tried to run towards the back of the store, towards the small office, but my legs wouldn't respond. I could only hear the men's screams as the creature got closer and closer. I was trapped. We were trapped. Suddenly, the gas station was completely illuminated, blinding white light filling every corner, and the men's screams were silenced in an instant as if they were absorbed by something larger, something formless. Only the echo remained, echoing in nothingness. I ran towards the door, struggling to open it. Something was pushing me back, as if the walls themselves were trying to prevent me from leaving. My breathing was erratic, fear permeated my bones, but I finally managed to open it. When I came out, I saw him. The creature was already a few meters away from me. His eyes shone with insatiable hunger, and as I approached, the darkness itself seemed to swallow the air around me. My heart was pounding, almost to the point of bursting, and at that moment I knew there was no escape. The figure stopped in front of me, and for a brief second everything was silent. Then, before I could do anything, darkness enveloped me completely, and the world ceased to exist. Silence spread through the gas station. The light went out again, and the creature faded into the darkness. Only the empty station remained, with the cash register open and money scattered on the floor. The three men were never found, but if someone stops to look carefully at the gas station's security cameras, they might see something strange. A last glimpse of the creature's face reflected in the glass. A face that, for a brief second, looks like me. Maria had always been a very talented artist. His brushes, guided by his trembling hands, managed to capture the deepest part of the human soul on each canvas. However, despite his success, he was never able to find a true connection to the masterpiece he felt he was meant to create. He wanted something bigger, something that would define his career and his life. So he had decided to retreat to a cottage in the country, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, in search of that spark of inspiration he was so missing. The cabin was located in a remote location, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to have been forgotten by time. When Maria arrived, the first thing she noticed was the heavy, dense air, as if nature itself were watching her. The wooden walls creaked under the weight of the years, and the wind that whispered through the cracks of the cabin seemed to carry echoes of distant voices. Maria, however, did not pay much attention to it. She was determined to find what she was looking for, the inspiration for her masterpiece. It was several days before Maria began to feel the weight of loneliness. During the day, he would dedicate himself to painting, capturing the essence of nature on canvases. But as night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin became more and more oppressive. The creaking of the wood and the whispers of the wind were beginning to take on an unsettling hue, as if someone were watching her. One afternoon, after several failed attempts to find inspiration, Maria decided that her next portrait would be different. Instead of the tranquil landscapes she had been painting, she decided to create a portrait of herself. He wanted to capture the deepest look of his soul, the one he had never shown to the world. He got ready, placed the canvas on the easel, and began to paint, letting himself be carried away by his darkest emotions. As he moved forward, he began to feel a strange sensation, as if something was happening in the air, but he decided to ignore it and continue. The paint on her face was beginning to take shape, and although at first it was only a reflection of herself, something was beginning to change. His eyes on the canvas seemed more alive, more intense. Suddenly, the lines of the portrait seemed to move, as if the image was breathing. Maria put the brush down in her hand and watched, horrified. It couldn't be possible. The portrait was moving, his eyes sliding back and forth as if searching for something in the dark. A cold sweat ran down his back. What was happening? He tried to give it a few more touches, but as he did so, the figure seemed to come to life. Suddenly, the portrait began to cry. He cried blood. A torrent of red poured from his eyes, bathing the canvas as the paint distorted as if a tormented soul was trapped inside. Maria backed away in horror, paralyzed by fear. The screams of the figure in the portrait seemed to resonate in her mind, a sound she could not understand but which filled her with terror. The portrait seemed to be watching her with fury, with hatred. It wasn't his own reflection that was painted on the canvas, but something much darker, something that had never existed in his real life. Trembling, Maria tried to cover the portrait with a cloth, but she couldn't get out of his sight. The painting cried incessantly, as if it were alive. As the hours passed, the crying became louder, more unbearable. Every tear of blood fell to the floor, causing the room to be filled with a metallic smell, and the atmosphere became more and more oppressive. Something was wrong. Something very wrong. The portrait didn't just cry. He was beginning to move more, squirming on the canvas as if he were looking for a way out. Maria, terrified, began to hear whispers coming from the portrait. Every word was incomprehensible, but every single one of them resonated in his mind with terrifying force. He covered his ears with his hands, but whispers seeped into his mind, as if an evil presence was taking control of his thoughts. In desperation, Maria tried to leave the cabin, but the doors slammed shut as if the cabin itself wanted to trap her. The air was becoming thick, and the walls seemed to shrink around him. Every corner was filled with shadows that moved, as if they were lurking, waiting. The cabin was no longer a refuge, it had become a trap. The painter began to feel how the energy of painting enveloped her. The figure in the portrait called to her, attracted her. Every time he looked at the canvas, he felt part of his soul detach and join the portrait. Fear consumed her, but she couldn't get away. He knew he had to destroy the painting, but he didn't know how. Each attempt to touch the portrait only made the figure more alive, as if every brushstroke he added strengthened it. One night, while trying to sleep, he was awakened by a strange noise. The cry of the painting called to her, but this time there was something else. The whispers were clearer, more direct. The voice that emanated from the painting was hers, as if it were she herself who cried, who asked for help. Maria began to feel something inside her change. Desperation took hold of her. The terror I felt was no longer just because of what I saw, but because of what I was beginning to understand. The figure in the portrait was not only a representation of her, but was taking her place, absorbing her essence, her life. If I didn't destroy the portrait, I would end up being part of it, trapped on the canvas forever. In desperation, Maria took a knife and began cutting the canvas, attempting to destroy the figure before it was too late. But each cut only made the figure more powerful. The shadows in the room were twisting, and the cabin began to vibrate as if something dark was waking up. With each cut, the portrait cried louder, and the blood that fell from the canvas began to drip onto the floor, forming dark puddles that seemed to swallow everything they touched. Terror took hold of her completely. I could no longer distinguish between the real thing and what I was seeing in the painting. His mind was cracking, and the whispers were turning into unbearable screams. The figure in the portrait was no longer just looking at her. Now he pointed at her as if he were condemning her. Mary knew that she had no time, that she had to destroy it immediately. With one last effort, he took the portrait and threw it into the fire in the fireplace. The canvas began to burn, but the scream that the figure uttered when the fire touched it was the most frightful he had ever heard. The flames seemed to devour the paint, but something else was happening. The shadows that had once moved around the hut were now concentrated in the fire, as if they wanted to prevent the portrait from disappearing. When the portrait was finally consumed in the flames, the hut fell silent. The air cleared and the oppressive atmosphere began to dissipate. Maria fell to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, had disappeared. However, when he looked at his hands, he noticed something strange. His skin was beginning to take on a gray hue as if it was crumbling. His body felt light, almost ethereal, and his face reflected an expression of horror that he had never seen before. At that moment, he understood what had happened. She hadn't destroyed the portrait. The portrait had destroyed her. It was a cold afternoon. The fog was sliding through the streets, partially hiding the streetlights that illuminated the cobblestones. There was something eerie in the air, as if the city itself was crouching, waiting. I was walking aimlessly through the antique market. It was a place I frequented from time to time, looking for something that fit my taste for vintage. Although I had never encountered anything truly impressive, there was something different in the air that afternoon, something that made my steps slow, as if time itself was stuck. The tables were filled with objects forgotten by the passing of the years, pocket watches with faces stained with rust, black iron candelabras that seemed to have been touched by fire, and an assortment of framed portraits, some worn, others almost intact. That's when I saw her. It was at the end of a small stall, between a pile of books and a pile of broken plates. An old photograph carefully framed in dark wood that caught attention for no apparent reason. A woman's face was immortalized in the photo. His expression was serene, as if he had posed for the portrait with a distant purpose in mind. What caught my attention the most was the look. The woman's eyes seemed to follow me, moving as I moved in front of her. A strange feeling took over me, but curiosity got the better of me. I took it in my hands, observing the details more closely. The woman was dressed in an old fashion, perhaps from the beginning of the century, with a black corset that hugged her figure and a crown of dried flowers on her head. Everything in the photograph seemed immersed in a kind of sadness, as if the image had captured a moment before the storm. The scene was dark, with a hazy background that seemed to extend beyond what was visible. But what really made me uncomfortable was a diffuse shadow in the upper right corner, barely noticeable. I decided to buy it. The price was ridiculous for a photograph of that time, and the feeling of attraction was too strong. The lady who ran the stall, a woman with an expressionless face, didn't say a word when I bought it. She just took the money and handed me the photograph. He didn't even look me in the eyes, as if he knew something I didn't. When I returned home, I put the photo on the living room table, not really knowing what to do with it. As strange as she was, something about her seemed comforting to me. Something about his presence seemed to calm me, although the restlessness was still present. I left her there and went to prepare some dinner. Hours passed and night took over the apartment. While I was eating, I noticed that the photo was slightly shifted. The image of the woman seemed to have changed position, her face now tilted slightly more to the left. I thought it might have been the wind or a minor tremor, but something didn't feel right. It was as if the woman in the photo was moving on her own, as if she was somehow aware of what was happening in the room. I reached out to adjust the frame, but at that moment something stopped me. As I looked at the image more closely again, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. In the upper right corner, where before I had seen only a shadow, I now made out a human figure. Its face was vague, like a diffuse silhouette, but what terrified me most was that the figure seemed to be looking in my direction. It was as clear as if it had been there from the beginning, but he couldn't have seen it before. Had the photo changed? Or had the shadow been there all along, simply waiting to be discovered? My mind began to spin in search of an explanation. I moved away from the photo frame, but the air in the room had changed. It felt dense, as if the atmosphere itself was about to break apart. I turned around to go get some water, but as I did, something in the mirror's reflection stopped me. I could see the photo again, but this time the figure of the woman in the image seemed to be moving. In the reflection, his eyes were no longer following me, but were now fixed on something behind me. My body tensed. A cold sweat began to run down my back. I turned slowly, but there was nothing. Just the darkness of the room, the absolute silence. I didn't know what to do. Fear was beginning to take shape, like a presence in the same room, enveloping me with its invisible weight. I decided to go out to the balcony to get some fresh air. I needed to clear my head. As I left, I felt a chill run through my skin. It wasn't just the cold. There was something else, something moving in the shadows, something that shouldn't be there. My heart was pounding, almost as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. I looked down the empty street, and it was at that moment that I heard a sound. Something that didn't belong in the environment, a low whisper, almost imperceptible, but clear enough for him to recognize it. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He was behind me. I turned sharply, but the air was still empty. The feeling of being watched intensified with each passing second. My body was shaking. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing alongside me. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt a tangible presence, something that was slowly getting closer, as if the space around the photograph was distorting, as if the image was devouring the room, crossing the limits of the photograph and dragging me with it. I went back inside, and then I saw him. In the reflection of the mirror, the woman in the photograph was no longer alone. There was someone else with her, a blurry figure, a presence that did not belong to that time. He was standing right behind the woman, his face completely covered by shadows. Only a pair of bright eyes could be made out that glowed with an evil intensity. At that moment, a shudder ran through me. It was no longer just an old photo. It was no longer just a still image. Something in her had come to life, something that should never have existed. The feeling of panic was so strong that the air became thick, almost impossible to breathe, as if time had stopped and the worst was yet to come. I walked towards the photo, ready to destroy it, to get rid of it. But when my fingers touched the frame, I felt a cold, ethereal hand close around my wrist. The image began to distort before my eyes. The woman smiled, but her smile was crooked, macabre. In that moment, I realized that I had made a fatal mistake. I shouldn't have touched that photograph. I shouldn't have bought it. I knew it in my heart, in the depths of my being. I was trapped. With a cry of despair, I tried to let go, but the hand that held me wouldn't let me go. The shadow behind the woman in the photo grew larger, more prominent. With an ear-piercing scream, the figure glided toward me, and as I glanced one last time at the photograph, I knew I was no longer alone. The person who had recently disappeared was here, and he was staring at me intently through the photo. He was looking at me from the other side, and then everything went out. The photograph was found by the police several days later, lying on the floor of the apartment intact. However, the image had changed. The woman in the photo was no longer smiling. His face was frozen in an expression of horror, and in the upper right corner, right next to his figure, a new shadow appeared, the same one that had been chasing me. Nobody knows what happened that night, or where I ended up. The photo, however, continues to appear at the antique market, and always without fail someone buys it. There was something strange about the cabin from the moment I arrived. Nothing I saw out of place seemed to justify the sensation that coursed through my body. A slight discomfort, a pulling on the skin as if something was watching me from the shadows. The trees surrounding the cabin were tall and dense, as if they were trying to embrace the place. But that didn't worry me. What worried me was the calm. It was not the relaxing tranquility of a nature retreat. It was the calm of something that knew too much, the calm that precedes a whisper in the dark, a movement that should not be there. I hadn't realized how bad I felt until I entered the cabin. The thick wooden door creaked open, but that wasn't the sound that chilled my blood. It was the silence that followed him. There was no echo, no noise, not even the creaking of wood in the structure of the cabin. It was as if the sound simply died out in the air, absorbed by something I couldn't understand. I put my suitcase on the table and took a quick walk around the place. The cabin was simple, rustic, but cozy. A fireplace in one corner, a wooden table in the center, a vase on a shelf that showed withered flowers. The decoration was austere, but warm. There shouldn't be anything that would make me feel uncomfortable. Hours passed, and night fell over the forest. The air was fresh and sharp, and the lights in the cabin came on at dusk. I sat by the fireplace with a cup of hot tea, searching my thoughts for a way to relax them, to erase the tension that had been taking over my body. Maybe it was just the stress of daily life, I thought, or the loneliness I felt in the middle of nature. But something wasn't right. As the night progressed, I began to hear noises, little whispers, creaks, as if someone was walking close to the walls without actually stepping on the floorboards. At first I thought it might be the sound of trees moving in the wind, but that idea soon dissolved. The wind whispered no words. I stood up from my chair with a slight feeling of panic, trying to rationalize what was happening. I walked towards the kitchen, but when I returned to the living room, something made me stop. The vase. The vase of withered flowers was no longer on the shelf. He didn't remember touching it, but he couldn't be sure. I searched the entire room, checking every corner, but I couldn't find the vase. Finally, I saw it. It was on the floor next to the fireplace, as if someone had dropped it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Maybe he had moved it accidentally. But there was something else at that moment, something he couldn't identify, something that hovered in the air, that whispered to me that I shouldn't be there. It was a deep feeling of unease, as if the cabin itself was watching me. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed in the chair by the fireplace, my eyes fixed on the shadows that slid along the walls. Every creak, every noise made me jump out of my chair, and when I looked up at the windows, I saw nothing but darkness. The feeling of being watched did not disappear, but grew. The tension grew in the air, thick as a fog, and with each passing minute, my body grew more tense. My nerves sharpened. The next morning came, but it brought me no comfort. On the contrary, something worse happened. The vase was back in its place on the shelf as if nothing had happened. At first, I felt relieved, like it was all a figment of my imagination. However, upon realizing what had happened, a chill ran down my spine. There was no way for the vase to return to its place by itself. I had seen him fall the night before. A deep fear settled in my chest. Something was in the cabin, something that didn't belong here, something that was playing with me. The afternoon slipped by slowly, but the hours passed in a torrent of anxiety. I decided to take a walk in the woods, thinking that I could calm down, that I could think clearly. But the forest didn't give me any peace. In fact, the air seemed thicker than he remembered, as if it was being sucked in by something foreign. Every step I took on the earthy ground was absorbed by my surroundings, and I felt like something was watching me, lurking in the shadows. However, upon returning to the cabin, something worse happened. The vase was on the floor again. This time, however, the flowers weren't just wilted. They were dry, decomposed, as if they had been there for weeks, as if something had left them there for a purpose. Something had left them for him to see, to touch, to know that he was no longer alone. A deep terror enveloped me as I realized that I could not escape. I decided to investigate. He remembered the legends he had heard from the people in the nearby town about the old cabins that had been built centuries ago. The cabins in the forest were said to be built on ancient forgotten grounds, where the spirits of lost souls still wandered, trapped between two worlds. waiting to be freed by those foolish enough to approach. That night I couldn't sleep. Fear gripped me as I listened to the creaks and rustles within the walls. Something was crawling, something was trapped, and I wasn't the only living thing in that place. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't stop hearing the voices. I couldn't tell if it was my mind or if someone was really calling me from within the walls. The feeling of a presence intensified, and finally desperation led me to the desperate conclusion. The cabin was not empty. Something or someone lived inside her, and he wasn't willing to let me go. In a fit of panic, I took out a flashlight and began banging on the walls, screaming, begging, looking for any sign of an escape. That's when I saw him. A crack in a wall, too small for a human being, but big enough for something else. Something that slipped between the cracks, between the rotten woods of the cabin. Something he had been waiting for, lurking in the darkness. My breathing became erratic. My mind began to collapse. I decided to leave, run away. But when I tried to open the door, something stopped me. The door no longer opened. A figure emerged from the crack in the wall, a shadow that did not belong to this world, an unnatural shape, long and thin, with empty eyes, with crooked hands that reached out towards me. The last thing I heard before darkness enveloped me was the sound of creaking wood behind me, as if the cabin itself was absorbing me, devouring me. And the door never opened again. The cabin in the woods was found weeks later, but no one knows what happened to the visitor. The cabin remains standing, empty, but the people who approach feel the same strange sensation, the same fear palpable in the air. Nobody dares to enter. The vase is still there in its place on the shelf. The flowers always withered, always dry, as if they had never been touched, as if they had always been waiting. And the shadows continue to move behind the walls. Night had fallen like a heavy blanket over the road, obscuring everything in its path. Starlight barely filtered through the clouds, and the moon, if it existed, seemed to be hidden under a layer of thick fog. The sound of your car's engine, which was previously a constant, had completely gone away. You were stranded in the middle of a deserted road, with no company other than the dim light of streetlights in the distance, and the oppressive feeling of being completely alone. You had traveled kilometers without finding a single car that could help you, nor a service station where you could fill up the tank. The last drops of gasoline had run out, and the damn cell phone, which only moments before had been full of signal, was now dead without any connection. The horizon was empty, and the cold was beginning to penetrate your bones. You had stopped here because you thought this place would be quiet, away from the city and its noises. You never imagined loneliness could feel so dangerous. The clock was almost midnight when you heard something in the distance. A beacon of light was slowly approaching, like a beacon in the dark, the sound of the accompanying engine echoing loudly as it approached. At first you thought it might be another vehicle in the distance, but soon the sound amplified, and the light, which had seemed distant before, was getting closer. A car was approaching, and you, although relieved, felt a slight knot in your stomach. You knew something wasn't right. Something in the atmosphere of the deserted road, in the stillness of the night, told you that not everything would be so simple. The car, a dark and weathered model, stopped right next to you. The engine died, and from inside, the door creaked open. A tall man, wearing a trench coat that seemed too thick for the heat that still lingered in the air, stepped out of his vehicle. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, and the face you could see at first was partially covered by the shadow of his hat. "Can I help you?" he asked in a deep, raspy voice, as if he were used to not talking much. You were grateful for the help, although something about the way his gaze stayed on you made you feel uncomfortable. It wasn't a friendly look. There was something else behind her, something you couldn't identify but felt with palpable intensity. The man advanced towards you leisurely, as if he had nowhere to go. "I ran out of gas." Your voice sounded shaky, almost as if you couldn't escape the feeling of being watched by something other than his eyes. The man nodded slowly, his eyes traveling over your car and then back to your face. "I see," he said without much emotion. "You don't have any luck at night, do you?" You didn't know why, but his tone of voice seemed to resonate with something that made your blood run cold, as if the situation was more complex than it might seem at first glance. Instead of pulling out a hose or a gas can, the man moved closer to you, as if he had a need to observe every detail. "I can help you." His voice was lower now, almost whispery, as if he were saying something that only you should hear. He offered you a crooked smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Something in his expression made you feel even more uncomfortable, but the desire to get out of there was greater than the fear you were beginning to feel. You accepted his offer. At that moment, the sound of another engine interrupted the tension that had been building. One more car, this one with brighter lights, was approaching quickly. The strange man looked towards the road, as if he didn't expect anyone else to appear. "I'll help you as soon as this is over," he said calmly, without moving or turning his body towards the other vehicle. A strange hint of hope crossed your mind. The other car stopped a few meters away. A man came out quickly, flashlight in hand, looking around. He seemed nervous, eyes wide, as if something was out of place. "Is everything okay here?" he asked in a worried tone, noticing the strange atmosphere that had formed. His gaze went straight to the man in the trench coat. The stranger, with inexplicable calm, nodded, but something in his face changed. He didn't seem so friendly anymore. The man with the flashlight took a step back, and you noticed how his expression went from doubt to even greater concern. The atmosphere became tense. "You're getting into something dangerous." The man with the flashlight, trembling, seemed to want to intervene again, but the figure of the stranger interrupted him. "It's none of your business." The latter's voice was deeper now, with a harshness that made you shudder. The two stared at each other as if locked in a silent battle, and for a moment everything was suspended. Suddenly, the man with the flashlight stepped back, casting a terrified look at you. Without saying anything else, he got into the car and accelerated as soon as he could, driving away quickly. The stranger didn't make a single move to stop him. He stood still, staring at the empty road with the same disturbing calm. The silence that followed was even more eerie than before, a feeling of claustrophobia enveloping everything, as if the air had become thick. You stared at the strange man, who hadn't said a word since the other left. The question hung in the air, and you knew something terrible was about to happen. Finally, the man in the trench coat moved even closer to you. His shadow covered most of your body, and you could feel the warmth of his closeness. The feeling of danger was palpable, as if everything was about to collapse on you. "You're going to die here." The words from his mouth sounded with a tone of resignation. That's when you understood it, when you saw it. The man who had shown up to help you was not a well-intentioned stranger. He was the hunter, and you were the prey. At that same moment, a gust of cold wind crossed the road, and something moved behind you in the darkness. Fear washed over you like a violent wave, and in the same instant you understood what was happening. The man in the raincoat was no longer the only danger. The road itself, the loneliness, the darkness. Everything was conspiring to trap you in its deadly embrace. You looked at the stranger, his eyes now completely vacant, and a shiver ran down your spine. You were completely trapped, with no way out. And before you could scream, the darkness swallowed you whole. The road, like the night, never forgave. The man in the raincoat disappeared into the darkness, but he was no longer alone. Somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the vast expanse of asphalt, was your car, stopped forever, and in the air, the echo of your last breath slowly faded. There was never a rescue or any other intervention. The desert hunters knew how to play their cards. You were never the first, and you wouldn't be the last. The lonely road was still just that, lonely, and the shadows that stalked the night continued to wait, anxious for the next victim. Since I moved into the neighborhood, everything seemed normal. The house I chose had a cozy feel, a white facade with dark wood details, and a small but well-kept garden. My life had taken an important turn, moving away from a monotonous routine in the city to seek tranquility in a more isolated place. It was the kind of place that seemed to be removed from the turmoil of the world, something I needed after months of stress. My neighbor Jake showed up the first day. He seemed to be the embodiment of kindness, tall, dark hair, and an easy smile. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know," he told me as he extended a hand to me. The conversation was brief but pleasant. I thought I had found the perfect partner for this new stage in my life, someone close in the neighborhood with whom to share an occasional chat. The first weeks were calm. I went out to work, came home, and the nights were lonely but peaceful. Jake's house was right next door, and although his presence didn't bother me, it was hard not to notice his routine. He was always outside when he returned, whether doing his yard, cleaning his car, or just sitting on his porch. There was something disturbing in the constancy with which she saw him, as if she had an obsessive need to look around her. I started to feel uncomfortable, but I chalked it up to the natural anxiety of moving to a new place. However, the little things that went unnoticed at first began to add up. I noticed that his curtains moved constantly, even when there was no wind, and if I looked closely, it seemed like there was always something behind them. His window faced mine, and many times I felt his gaze fixed on my room, as if he were watching me through the glass. At first I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was a coincidence, but things got stranger. One afternoon, returning home from a long day at work, I found a note folded neatly under my door. At first I didn't understand what was happening. The note said only one word: "Be careful." My heart skipped a beat. The lyrics were unfamiliar to me, but they were written so precisely that it seemed more like a warning than a threat. The first time I saw Jake after finding the note, he smiled at me like always. But this time there was something in his look that made me shudder, like he was watching me with an intensity I'd never noticed before. "Is everything okay?" he asked me, his tone too kind, as if he were waiting for an answer he had never requested. I didn't know how to react. I tried to put the incident behind me, but the notes kept coming. They were always there when I returned from my day, neatly folded and placed under my door. "Watch your back. Don't go out at night. Be careful what you do." The warnings grew more and more intense, and my anxiety skyrocketed. The idea that someone knew my movements in such detail filled me with terror. I tried to ignore it at first, but I couldn't help but wonder if Jake had something to do with it. Maybe he wasn't as innocent as he seemed. I decided to keep an eye on him a little more closely. One night, after a long day, I sat by the window, looking out at Jake's house from my room. Through the curtains, I could see him moving back and forth as if he were waiting for something. The sounds from his house were louder that night, more disturbing. I could hear footsteps, shuffling on the ground, followed by absolute silence. That's when doubt took over me. My heart beat faster when I saw a figure approaching the window. I froze. It was Jake, who peeked out almost imperceptibly, observing my house. His face was barely illuminated by the dim moonlight, but his expression was clear. He was looking directly toward my window. Fear ran through me like a chill, and my mind began to spin rapidly. He could no longer ignore what was happening. That same night, after much deliberation, I decided to go to the police. I told them about the notes and what had been happening, but they assured me that there was nothing that would indicate criminal behavior. Without direct evidence, they told me they couldn't do much. I felt helplessness wash over me. What could I do? If I talked more about this, I might sound paranoid. Nobody would take me seriously. The next day, the situation worsened. When I returned home, I saw a strange shadow in Jake's window. I wasn't sure if it was him or someone else, but something told me it was him. My stomach twisted with fear. That afternoon, I decided to face the situation and talk to Jake directly. I needed to know what was happening. I knocked on the door of his house, taking deep breaths to calm my nerves. Jake opened instantly, his face showing that familiar smile, but this time something in his eyes was different. He was more serious, more calculating. "Hello, how can I help you?" he asked in a soft voice. I looked him in the eyes and told him what I was feeling, what had been happening, the notes and the constant feeling of being watched. Jake showed no surprise. In fact, it seemed like he was already expecting it. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice lower, as if he were about to confess something. "I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable, it's just..." His gaze drifted to the floor, and for a moment I thought he was going to tell me something important, something that would give me answers. But instead, he looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry. Everything will be fine. You'll see." Something in his tone, in the way he avoided my eyes, made me recoil. I felt a chill run through me. Something wasn't right. I returned home with my heart in my throat, and when I closed the door, I noticed that the curtains in his house were moving again. Jake was there, watching me. That night, I decided to install a security camera in front of my house. I wanted to know what was happening, what Jake was doing. As the night progressed, fear paralyzed me. What else could I discover? What else would Jake do? The camera started recording. Shortly after, I saw something on the screen that made my blood run cold. Jake was in my garden. I was walking around my house, looking in all the windows, touching the walls with my hands. He stopped in front of my bedroom window, looking in as if waiting for me to invite him. My breathing quickened and a deep panic took over me. What was I doing in my garden? Why hadn't I realized? I watched the recording one more time and something changed inside me. Now he understood what had been happening. Jake hadn't just been watching me. He'd been waiting for a moment like this. I knew that one day I would find out, but it was too late. That same night, I heard a knock on my door. A slight but unmistakable sound. Nobody knew it was there, no one else had visited me. When I opened the door, no one was there, just a new note under the door. "You are mine now." Terrified, I knew I couldn't flee. I couldn't hide from him. There was something about Jake that I couldn't understand, something dark and twisted that had been stalking me all along. When she looked at me for the last time through her window that night, her smile was no longer the same. It was something I couldn't describe, a smile that showed knowledge, control, and imminent danger. And then, I knew I would never leave there. Jake had already won. He was no longer at home. He was in mine. When I moved into the house, I had no idea what I was about to experience. I had been looking for a quiet place to start over, somewhere away from the hustle and bustle of the city, somewhere that would allow me to start from scratch. After the separation, the last few months had been a chaos of decisions, paperwork, and too many visits to lawyers. Changing residence seemed like a simple solution, a way to turn my life around. And when I found the house, it was like everything had fallen into place. The house was located on the edge of a small town. It was old, one of those homes that had been there for generations, with architecture that hadn't been touched since the early 20th century. The garden was unkempt, with tall grass and vines creeping over the walls, but there was something attractive about its neglect. Perhaps it was his story that had caught my attention. For weeks, I immersed myself in searching for his background, but found nothing relevant. Nothing that could have warned me of what was to come. At first, everything was perfect. The house had that cozy air that is enjoyed when everything is in its place. I spent my first few days arranging furniture, unpacking boxes, enjoying the solitude I so desired. The routine seemed calm, even comforting, but that sense of security soon began to crumble. It was on the third night that the first sign of something strange appeared. I was sitting in my living room with a glass of wine, watching television to distract myself from the tiredness of the day. The house was silent, as always. Suddenly, a slight creak made me look up. The sound came from the direction of the hallway door, right in front of me. It was almost completely dark, save for the dim light coming from a table lamp near the couch. I fixed my gaze on the door. There was nothing visible, but something in the air seemed to have changed. The atmosphere was no longer calm. Something had been altered. It was a normal door, made of aged wood with a worn metal knob. In its panels, the dim light of the room was reflected, creating shadows that moved gently to the rhythm of the breeze. But suddenly something moved in the reflection. A subtle change. Something wasn't right. At first, I didn't think too much about it. I thought it was my mind playing tricks due to tiredness. But as I approached the door, my reflection seemed different. It wasn't the same. My movements felt slower, as if something in the reflection was acting on its own. I thought the lighting was to blame, maybe the angle. But looking at myself again, I realized there was something else. The image in the reflection did not completely match mine. There was a slight mismatch, a shadow that didn't belong. My breathing quickened and I took a step back. I thought in my mind once again, was I getting paranoid? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching something that wasn't me. That night I went to bed with a nagging restlessness. I couldn't sleep well. Despite my fatigue, my eyes did not close completely. Every time I felt like I was about to fall asleep, a small vibration in the house would wake me up. A rustling that I couldn't identify, but that made me feel like someone was there, watching, waiting. Finally, I fell asleep, but not in one fell swoop. It was an interrupted dream, like someone was constantly waking me up. The next day, I decided to ignore what I had seen at the door. I didn't want to give too much importance to the details that could just be a product of my tired mind. But the second night, the feeling returned, this time with more force. I went to the door and stared at her. The reflection was still there, but this time it was clearer. The shadow of my reflection wasn't just subtly wrong, it was distorted, as if something else was inside my own image, something that wasn't human. Something dark, a shape that glided slowly as if it were approaching through the glass of the door. I turned around immediately, my heart racing. I ran into the hallway, but there was nothing. Only the walls that whispered in the silence of the night. However, the feeling persisted. Something was stalking me, something I couldn't see, but it was there, watching me with invisible eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours checking the corners of the house, looking for some logical explanation. But every time I passed the door, I felt like something was watching me, like something was getting closer and closer. In the end, I convinced myself that I was being irrational, but the feeling did not go away. The next few days became stranger. The reflection in the door began to show me things it didn't before. When I got closer, my image on the glass became more distorted. It began to move independently. I saw my reflection smiling, but my lips didn't move. I saw my face crumple into an expression of pain, but I didn't feel it. It was as if my reflection had a life of its own, something I had no control over. One night I decided to face the terror that was taking over me. He would place a camera in front of the door to record what was happening. I knew that if I could see it on video, I could at least rationalize what was happening. The camera recorded what I already feared. The reflection was not just mine, there was something else. During the recording, I saw my reflection start to move erratically. My body seemed to twist, as if I was unable to control its movements. The shadow grew larger, darker, and approached me in the reflection. I saw a pair of eyes glowing in the dark behind my reflection. And then the camera caught a whisper that chilled my blood. "I'm watching you." The voice was not mine, it was soft, deep, and evil. Terrified, I looked at the door. The reflection was empty. There was nothing, just the door reflected in the glass. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I felt trapped with no way out. Days passed and my anxiety grew. Every time I got closer to the door, I saw the figure in the reflection more clearly. He was no longer just a shadow. It was a being that fed on my fear, that got closer with every step I took. Finally, one night, I decided that I couldn't live with that presence anymore. I made the decision to leave the house. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. It was closed tightly, as if something from inside was blocking it. I hit the door with all my might, but it didn't budge. At that moment, I understood that I was not alone in that house. The being that had been watching me, that reflection, was not part of the door. It was a part of me, something that had come to life through my own fears, something that had fed on my anxiety, and now kept me trapped in an endless cycle of terror. The last time I saw the reflection, the shadow was no longer just a figure. Now it had taken over my image. His eyes, those dark eyes, peered into my face as my reflection smiled at me with a macabre smile, as if I had won the battle. As I watched, I felt like I was fading, like something was slipping away from me. And in that moment I understood that the reflection had taken my place. The door to the house remained closed, and now, every time someone passes by, they see a strange reflection in the old door. Something that doesn't belong, but never leaves. And inside the house, the figure continues waiting, watching for someone else to make the same mistake as me. The wind blew dry leaves across the deserted street. The trees, lined up like silent sentinels, swayed under the pressure of the frigid air, their branches creaking like broken bones. There was no one in the neighborhood who didn't talk about the house down the street. It was always the same theme: warnings, whispers, fears. Nobody wanted to get close to her. No one lived there, not even the bravest. The house was more than a simple construction. It was a presence, a scar on the landscape. But there was something in me, a curiosity that refused to give in to collective fear. Something that drove me to go beyond the warnings, the stories. Something that told me I should go in. My footsteps echoed on the pavement, the sound echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. I was determined. I was not going to back down. The neighbors looked at me from their windows with grim faces, some with expressions of pity, others with pure terror. They tried to talk to me, they warned me again, but I had already made my decision. I would enter. When I reached the corner, the house appeared before me like a giant shadow, deformed and threatening. Its facade was covered in vines that grew like tentacles, hugging the walls with a strength that seemed supernatural. The windows were broken, and the door, although closed, seemed to await my arrival with an eerie calm. I approached with my heart pounding in my ears. The door was locked with an old, rusty padlock, but something inside me knew it wasn't enough to stop me. I looked for a nearby rock, a large, heavy rock, and with a well-aimed blow, I broke the lock. The metal split with a metallic crunch, and the door slowly opened with a blood-curdling moan. Upon entering, darkness immediately enveloped me, as if the house itself wanted to swallow my presence. Cold air hit my face, filled with a musty, damp smell. The place was in complete abandonment, but as my eyes got used to the darkness, I could see strange details. The walls were covered in dark stains, as if something or someone had tried to crawl along them. On the ground, there were marks, footprints that could not have belonged to anyone alive. It was clear that something wasn't right, but I didn't stop. I walked down the hallway, with the feeling that something was watching me, that I was not alone. Every step I took me deeper into the darkness of the house. The furniture, covered in dust, seemed to have been abandoned suddenly, as if the people who lived there had fled without warning. However, there was something else in the air, something that made my hair stand on end, as if the house itself was waiting. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, sliding down the walls, blurring when I tried to focus on them. The sound of my own footsteps seemed to be amplified, echoing through the empty hallways. My breathing became heavier, more erratic, as if the atmosphere itself was squeezing my chest. In the distance, I heard a whisper. I wasn't sure if it was real or a figment of my mind, but I froze. The voice, weak but clear, was murmuring something I couldn't understand. It was like a song, but without melody, a low rumbling murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. My instinct told me that I should turn around, run away from there. But something else pushed me to keep going, to discover what was happening in that place. The shadows moving down the hallway seemed to form into vaguely human figures, although no clear details could be made out. Every time he looked closer, they disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if dissolving into thin air. Upon arriving at the main room, the first thing I noticed was the feeling of extreme cold. A chill ran down my spine, and the silence became even heavier, almost unbearable. The fireplace, although unlit, was surrounded by a series of deep marks on the wall, as if something or someone had tried to escape from there. But strangest of all was the figure in the center of the room, an antique chair, made of dark wood, with a worn seat. It was empty, but something told me it wasn't really empty. I approached cautiously, my feet barely touching the ground, as if I didn't want to make noise, as if I was afraid to break the fragile silence that had taken over the place. Suddenly, the whispering came back, louder now, and I could make out some words. "You're not alone, you won't come out." A loud bang echoed through the house, a roar that made me jump. I looked back toward the living room door and saw her. A figure glided across the threshold, shadowy and almost transparent, as if it were part of the darkness itself. The figure moved slowly, crawling on the ground, and although I couldn't fully see it, I felt its presence. His face was not fully formed, but his eyes shone with an unnatural intensity. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. Shadows began to take shape around the room, spreading across the walls, the furniture, the floor. They writhed, stretched, as if they were searching for something or someone. The figure that had appeared at the door took another step, and the air around him became heavier, almost impossible to breathe. "Go away, you shouldn't have come," a voice whispered from the shadows. My body reacted immediately. An irrational impulse made me turn around and run towards the door. But when I turned around, the exit was no longer there. The house had changed. The walls moved, warped, as if the structure itself was rearranging itself, imprisoning me. I couldn't breathe. Panic overwhelmed me. Every corner was full of shadows that now seemed to be denser, more powerful. In the background, in the darkness, I could see the figures of the former tenants, their faces disfigured, their bodies floating in the air, trapped in the house. They couldn't move, but their eyes looked at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Instantly, I understood the truth. The house was not empty. The shadows he had seen were not simple reflections of the darkness. They were the echoes of those who had lived there before, trapped in an intermediate dimension. Their souls, their minds, were trapped in the limbo of the house, condemned to wait for the next victim, someone like me, who dared to enter. I tried to back away, but there was no way out. The walls were closing in around me. The murmurs turned into screams, voices begging for release, for rest. But he couldn't help them, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Suddenly, one of the figures advanced towards me, its elongated, transparent fingers reaching for my arm. I felt its penetrating cold, as if a part of my soul was torn away by its fingers. The figure's eyes widened, a look of despair and suffering on its face, as it whispered in my ear, "You are one of us now." The shadows took shape again, this time surrounding me, enveloping me, dragging me into total darkness. The house had won. I was the new inhabitant, the new prisoner. And my shadow, now distorted, began to walk around the house at the end of the street, waiting for someone else curious like me to come and open the door.